Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, oh, I'm so glad you've come. Please follow me, said the old lady, gesturing me with her hands, guiding me down the dark passageway of her home towards the closed door of her bedroom. The permed spiral ringlets of her unnaturally fiery bright red hair were tightly tied back in a messy ponytail, clasped together with a fluffy bright orange band. Some of their trailing wisps having wilfully escaped their entrapment, they trailed loosely around her face, bobbing buoyantly on her shoulders like the sails on a boat. The woman's arctic blue eyes that reminded me of a pale summer sky seemed very intense as she hovered outside the bedroom door like a buzzard, wondering when was the quintessential opportune moment to actually enter the room. She eyed me nervously. Her hesitancy was pronounced. She was certainly not eager to enter. "Everything all right?" I asked the woman. "You seem, well, a little nervous, a little flustered, perhaps." At that, the woman seemed to come out of her internal turmoil with a flying start, rather like a trapped bird having finally found the open window. She took in a deep breath, straightened, and tensed her back, visibly stiffening. She stood as still as an ice statue, hardly daring to move a muscle, fearful of making even a sound, while she placed a suggestive finger on her lips, as if warning me to be very quiet, while pressing her ear against the door, as though listening inside for something. In a very low, hushed voice, she whispered, "The radio's off. That's a very good sign. I think he's fallen asleep, fast asleep. Now is the perfect opportunity to have some words with you before he wakes up. The last thing I want is for him to eavesdrop." "I'm afraid," she said, "my husband, well, he's a very difficult man. Very cantankerous, a grouchy man, as stubborn as an old boot at the moment, with a loose tongue on him. You must please mind his manners. He's rather like a snapping turtle. All the other physiotherapists have refused to come back to treat him because of his belligerence. I hope you won't end up being one of them, and abandoning him like the others. That would be more than I could possibly bear. He's not really that bad, really, all bark and no bite. I secretly suspect he wouldn't be so moody if he wasn't in pain, although he's not admitting that he is. The trouble that leg is giving him has certainly put him on a short fuse." "So what happened to your husband? Why did he shatter his leg so badly like this? I've read the doctor's report. It's quite a substantial injury." "I don't know," said the lady, looking at me blankly. "I'd love an answer to that question myself. All I know is that a hunter found him lying in a heap under a large spruce tree, but he was behaving strangely, refused to talk, even after numerous surgeries to that leg of his. I'm still none the wiser as to what happened to him. It's all decidedly strange." "Why would he keep something like this from you?" I asked. "Surely it's straightforward what happened to him, I mean." "My enigmatic husband is a man of few words, I'm afraid. Getting anything out of him is like extracting blood from a stone. Sometimes he's impossible," she said, looking at me tensely. "Sorry, I didn't get your name, girl." "Lily Harper." "Lovely name, dear. It does suit you so well. I've always loved flowery names. They're so pretty. They remind me of summer meadows. Well, as I was saying, Lily, my husband Baron has always been introspective, self-contained and aloof. That's his nature. But no, he doesn't talk about that accident at all. If I so much as mention the accident to him, he snaps at me, jumps down my throat like an objectionable bullfrog, becomes erratic, vagarious, and almost fearful. Believe me, Baron Sawyer is many things, but a coward he is not. That man has nerves of steel. One of the bravest men I've ever known. Never been intimidated by a thing a day in his life. But after that accident, something transmogrified in him. But I cannot for the life of me fathom what it is. He's angry all the time, reactive, capricious, fluctuating in his moods, blowing hot and cold all the time. Interesting, I said. Very interesting. Your husband's case is fascinating. It sounds to me that your husband is showing signs of post-traumatic shock disorder. His unfathomable behaviour suggests as much to me, in my professional opinion, that is, but of course I'd have to talk to him first. The woman laughed at me, as if the very notion of her maverick husband being traumatised by anything so badly that he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder was not even comprehensible. But she knew all too well that her husband, Baron Sawyer, was as different after that accident as a tadpole is from a frog. So my suggestive words hung in the air like a noxious smell she would wilfully rather ignore than actually acknowledge. I had lived and worked in Fairbanks, Alaska all my life. When you live in this ruthless, inhospitable, unmerciful part of the world, with huge extremes of weather, most especially the long, drawn-out winter days, with threatening, implacable sub-zero conditions, not to mention the vast areas of uninhabited, desolate wasteland, much that is not even accessible by road from beyond the Alaskan towns, you become mindfully aware of the fragility of life, how fragile, vulnerable, helpless we actually all are. As inconspicuous little ants in such a substantial no-man's land, this most certainly meant that many Alaskans embraced life head-on, appreciating it as a treasured gift of God, making the most of every day and every opportunity, living it to the fullest, thriving, prospering, taking risks, in this reclusive badland, never ever knowing when one day your life could be demanded from you, in this unrepentant, snow-covered Sahara. Then there were, of course, other Alaskans too, overwhelmed by the secluded remoteness, sequestration and beleaguerment of the bleak, long, grueling months of insufferable cold winter days that had become cheerless, friendless to so many, who sought comfort in the power of drink to help alleviate their hopeless despair. So alcohol and drugs in this part of the world had become rampant. Living in Alaska makes you mindfully aware of the invisible war between man versus nature, of which man will ultimately always end up the loser. For the cruel blows of nature could catch us off guard at any given moment in time, wilfully taking you prisoner under her forceful power, or swallow you whole so that you disappear off the face of the earth, never to be seen or heard from again. The trouble with living in these relentless extremes in the Alaskan wilderness, there are invariably a plethora of things that can always go wrong, from freezing to death, getting hopelessly lost, or randomly encountering a dangerous predator. Anything could happen, and as a physiotherapist, I had heard it all and seen it all, so nothing surprised me. "Well, what are we doing standing here? Aren't you going to introduce me to my patient or not?" I asked, giving the woman a reassuring nudge. "After all, I'm here to help him walk again on that leg of his, am I not? So that he can resume a normal life." She nodded, looking at me warily, as if she was about to lead me into a den of wolves. I watched her nervously open the door to the bedroom. It creaked ajar, ever so slightly. She whispered, Baron, are you up? It's me, Lisa." "Oh, woman, leave me alone," grumbled a gruff, gravelly voice. "Can't a man get a bit of peace around here?" "Honey," said the old woman, opening the bedroom door more confidently this time, crossing the threshold over the wooden flooring, leading me directly into the room behind her. "This is your new physiotherapist. Her name's Lily Harper. She's come to help you with your exercises today." The cantankerous, irritable man looked at me scathingly. "Not another bloody therapist. Did I not tell you, Lisa? I'll walk on my own leg in my own good time. I'm so sick of being pushed around like this. I'm not a bloody rag doll for a puppeteer to bounce around on a plethora of strings, am I?" "It's good to meet you, Mr. Sawyer," I said, ignoring his angry protests. He was not the first grouchy, crabby patient I'd actually dealt with, nor would he be my last. "The feeling's not mutual," he said. "Do me a favour. Get the hell out of here. The last thing I need is a therapist butting her nose into my business. I told you. I'll walk again in my own time." "I'm not sure you will, Mr. Sawyer. Not without some professional help, that is, which is why I'm here. If you don't move your leg, it'll atrophy. It'll be a lot more difficult to walk on it then, especially when your muscles are all wasted. The sooner we get you moving on your leg, the better it'll be for you." "I wish they'd chopped the whole damn thing off and been done with it. Then I wouldn't have to put up with all this crap from the likes of well-meaning people like you, butting your nose in where it's not wanted, like a weasel in a box of cornflakes." "Actually, you would, Mr. Sawyer. I'd have to teach you how to walk on an artificial limb. It would be much more tortuous and grueling for you. Be grateful you still have your leg. I'm sure we can get you fighting fit in no time at all. Before you know it, you'll be back out there on the tundra, hunting, fishing, hiking, doing everything you did before." The man groaned. "All right," he said. "I'll do it if it means I can get rid of you. How long is this session going to take?" "Not long," I assured him. "The benefits are cumulative. The more we do the exercises, the easier it gets for you, as you begin to regain strength, build muscle. But I'm wondering why you're so reluctant to do these exercises in the first place, Mr. Sawyer. That is the big question." "Are you in a lot of pain? Because if you are, we can review your medications to see if we can find an alternative medication to make you more comfortable. No one should be in pain in this day and age, and suffer in silence. Pain can be managed these days." "It can," he said, his anger subsiding, and a glimmer of hopeful light illuminating his green eyes, like a train emerging through a dark tunnel, glad to see the light that had eluded it for a stretch. "It is rather uncomfortable," he admitted. "I get painful spasms in the thigh region, shooting pains, aches, pins and needles, throbbing sometimes." At this off-the-cuff, unexpected confession, his wife even looked surprised. Her eyes misted over with tears. "Oh, Baron," she said, "I suspected as much. Why on earth didn't you say anything? We could have done something sooner, and then maybe I wouldn't have to be living with such a bad-tempered grizzly for the last few weeks. I mean, I've been walking on eggshells for weeks now, terrified to say anything in case you jumped down my throat." Baron cleared his throat. "Other brave men have been through a lot worse than I have. Look what happened in Vietnam, with so many American soldiers. What right have I to complain about a little pain in my leg?" I sat down next to Mr. Sawyer's bed, grabbing one of his hands, squeezing it tightly. My action surprised him, catching him off guard. It was clear he hadn't expected this endearing gesture of encouragement from the likes of me, but I'm glad to say he seemed comforted by my spontaneous display of empathy. "Now that you mention the Vietnam War, Mr. Sawyer, that's a very interesting point of reference, I have to say, and of course comparison. If I may say so, in regards to your current condition, that is. First of all, I'd like to assure you that any of those young men that survived the Vietnam War, well, they did receive intensive pain management for their physical impediments. None of them needed to be heroes in dealing with that physical pain, just like you don't, but received all the morphine they required, as you should. But it was the wounds inside, Mr. Sawyer. Those were the ones that could never be bandaged up or ignored. Those wounds, if left to fester, become unbearable for many. It's known as post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll get to the point, Mr. Sawyer. Are you suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder? Your wife assures me that you made no mention of what caused you to damage your leg so badly. What happened to you, Mr. Sawyer? It might help if you were to talk about it." Mr. Sawyer's face went as white as a sheet, as the colour evacuated his skin, as fast as the drained water in a sink. He hadn't expected this confrontation. I noticed his veined hands began to shake, and it was as if his whole bed jiggled under this wobbling momentum. Lisa's eyelashes were quivering under the pressure of the droplets of tears that were gathering and clinging together on her hairs like opaque raindrops. "She's right, isn't she, Baron? She's hit the nail on the head, hasn't she? You're hiding something. I can see it in your face as clear as day. Tell us what happened. How did you hurt your leg like this?" Mr. Sawyer's face clammed up like a mussel in its shell. His jaw tightened, the muscle on his face clenched, and I detected in his bright green eyes a glint of vulnerability that I had never perceived before. "Maybe your husband doesn't want to talk about it now," I told Lisa, "but I'm sure when the time is right, he'll tell us what happened to him. Won't you, Mr. Sawyer?" Mr. Sawyer did not respond, but remained stiffly silent. His eyes seemed almost glazed, as though he was staring out into space and had left the confines of his bedroom, as if he was reliving an experience in his mind, one that he was not willing to share. Lisa looked at her husband warily. "Baron Sawyer, I wish you weren't so goddamned obstinate, intransigent, and downright bull-headed. Shall we get on with these exercises, so that the young filly here can leave? I'm sure she's got lots to do." "We're not doing any exercises this morning, Mr. Sawyer," I assured him. "We're not?" said Mr. Sawyer, unable to disguise his relief. He looked as if the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders, as if he could breathe again. "But I don't understand. You said—" "Forget what I said, Mr. Sawyer." I said this sifting through the medications on his side table, making a mental note of the colourful kaleidoscope of meds he was taking, some that I realised should not have been prescribed at all, as they could potentially make things a lot worse for him. "I will not be asking you to do any exercises until we get this pain of yours under control. I would, however, like to examine your leg, so that you can tell me where it exactly hurts. I will only be proceeding with your physiotherapy exercises when I'm completely satisfied that we've got you comfortable, and that your pain is being managed efficiently." When I had finished my examination, I informed the Sawyers that I was going to leave, but I would be back very soon to continue the therapy. "Goodbye, filly. This is the best physiotherapy session I've ever had. No exercise. It doesn't get better than that." "Enjoy it while it lasts, Mr. Sawyer, because I will be back," I said teasingly. "Have a great afternoon." Lisa closed the door of the bedroom behind us. I noticed her bright blue eyes were dancing as she studied me curiously. "Where did they get you from? You're like the light at the end of a rainbow, like an angel from heaven." "Until you came along, I had no hope," she said, the tears welling up in her eyes. "I saw Baron the way he was with you. He even called you Philly. He doesn't do that unless he likes someone. It was the way you were with him in there, so perceptive, intuitive, compassionate, discerning. None of the other therapists were like you at all. They didn't care like you do. It was like you could see right through his huge bravado. I knew he was in pain. I knew it. I knew he was hiding something, but you brought it all out into the open. Absolutely everything. I felt it in there. Something shifted. I might just get my husband back. I truly don't know how to thank you enough for what you've already done. You've given us hope. That was more than we could ever have asked for." "There's no need for that," I said, giving Lisa a warm, friendly hug. "I'm only doing my job. I'm a staunch believer in treating the whole person, not just the visible wounds. Take it from me, Lisa. Something happened to your husband. We know that. When he shattered his leg. Because his fractures are not just physical. They're internal. I mean to get it out of him, I really do. Otherwise, this thing that is eating his insides up will literally consume him alive. I need to get to the bottom of this enigmatic situation. That's why I love my job so much, Lisa. Helping lost people like your husband finding his way back again. For me, it's an honour, a real honour, to help people. And I won't be happy until the healing on the outside is as good on the inside. You're absolutely right, Lily. My husband's never been the same since he injured that leg of his. If our emotions are indeed like internal bones, he's fractured a few, let me tell you. And so it was I began the long, gruelling journey of physical therapy procedures with Mr. Sawyer. Slowly but surely, with his pain under control, he began to make phenomenal progress. I could see that this difficult, tumultuous man was just hiding behind an angry facade of self-preservation. But I knew that deep down in his gut, he had a story to tell. But I chose not to pressurize him on this matter until the time was right. And one day my enduring patience most certainly paid off. "Philly," he said, "come and sit down next to me." "Is something troubling you?" I asked him. In a manner of speaking, yes, I suppose it is. In truth, it's been irking me for a very long time. Remember when you came here, and you were talking about the Vietnam soldiers and post-traumatic stress disorder that they suffered? I remember, I said, reaching out for Mr. Sawyer's hand and giving it a big encouraging squeeze. Yes, I remember. Well, I think that maybe I do have the same condition after all. I think you have it, I said. I really do. I've suspected that for a long time. This is between me and you, he said, lowering his gravelly voice. I don't want Lisa to hear this. It would upset her far too much. Go on. Your wife's in the kitchen baking a cake. The coast is clear. Out with it. Well, like a lot of Alaskans, I'm an avid hunter, Philly. Have been so for many years. Many, many years. Long before you were even born. There's nothing I like better than getting up close and personal to the natural world. There is no place in the world I'd rather live than here in Alaska. For despite everything, amidst all the treacherous hazards of living out here, the beauty of Alaska transfixes your senses. It's prepossessing. The crisp fresh air, the glaciers, mountains, tundra, volcanoes, coastline, lakes, alpine meadows, highway passes. I love it all. Anyway, I was privy to an area of wilderness through a close friend of mine, who assured me was an exceptional all-round treasured spot for hunting that not many Alaskans had cottoned on to yet. A forest area surrounded by alpine meadows, and a large stream that meanders through the valley with a forceful, rambunctious current. So I followed the map that he'd drawn for me, that is, leaving Fairbanks behind. After a long journey, I finally drove down the long, windy, rugged road that was lined with very tight clusters of spruce trees on both sides of it. It overlooked an enchanting mountainous valley, where you could still see patches of white snow drizzling over the mountain like the icing on a rhubarber. I pulled my truck to the side of the road, parking on the small embankment. I found a very clear path through this tight, very bushy forest. At first it was laborious, hard going, walking through this heavily congested space, very overgrown by creepers. But then quite suddenly the scenery changed, as if by magic. The forest opened up generously into wide open paths that were beautifully cleared, and when I say cleared, beautifully cleared. I know it sounds crazy, but as I walked through this space, it was like entering another world. Its resplendent beauty was off the charts, Lily, let me tell you, in its visual aesthetic appeal. If you had told me I'd died and gone to heaven, I would almost certainly have believed you. This place, he sighed, looking at me with a look of wondrous awe on his face, was beguiling, bewitching, spectacular. I've lived in Alaska all my life, Lily, but never, and I repeat, never have I beheld such beauty. It brings to mind the family children's book. What's it called? The Secret Garden. I think the name is Frances Hodgkin Burnett. That's the author. It was just like that. In truth, I felt like an imposter, as if I'd invaded someone's personal space, as everything was pristinely maintained. There was viridescent green everywhere, bluebells, so many of them, dog violets, dog roses, cowslips. They laced the floor in an artist's collage of rich, vibrant colours. If that was not enough, the forest was basked in this ethereal light that was so magical, it took my breath away. It was like the light was almost musical. It was as if it danced, floated, infused the forest. It seemed to highlight the contours of every leaf, every flower, every tree trunk in this golden glaze that glistened, sparkled, twinkled. And that was when I saw a few deer comfortably frolicking in the woods that was fringed by the large alpine meadow. These deers did not behave in a normal way, Lily. You would have expected a wild animal to behave, that is. They were so tame, so very tame, almost like someone's pets, friendly even, Curious, very curious. They weren't the least bit afraid of me. Imagine that, Lily. They weren't afraid of me. I'm almost sure I could have gone up to them, stroked them. They wouldn't have batted an eyelid, I don't think. Are you kidding me? This is Alaska we're talking about. Dear, don't behave like that, I insisted. No, I'm not kidding, Lily. Do I look like I'm kidding? The deer, they were docile, gentle, calm, fearless. So you're saying that the deer didn't even flee when they saw you? That's peculiarly strange. I mean, you and your rifle in their eyes surely equals a predator. In my experience, deers always flee a predator. They're naturally skittish. They didn't flee. They watched me curiously with their eyes, as if they were trying to comprehend what I was doing there, almost as if I was the uninvited stranger trespassing on their turf, and they were literally saying, "Who are you?" As you can imagine, I almost certainly didn't want to shoot any of these beautiful deer. I mean, how could I? Not in the circumstances. It would have been wrong. Very wrong. Even I knew that. All of a sudden I heard a tuneful whistle, as if someone was whistling a euphonious song, but not one that I recognised. The sound was very pretty, Lily. Sweet-sounding, mellifluent, musical. That was when I realised that someone was in the woods with me. I could sense a ponderous presence, like you would feel if a huge grizzly bear entered this bedroom now. Even without that whistling, I knew someone was there, or shall we say, someone was coming. On my part, I did feel like an intruder in this wooded sanctuary, almost as if I'd broken into someone's house. But I had as much right to be in those woods as any other person living in Alaska. Of course you did, I said encouragingly. Of course you did. I decided to hide behind a spruce tree. I could hear the person coming. For some reason I didn't want to be seen by them, even though I wasn't trespassing, but I felt like I was. I hid behind a tree while a couple of doe with their pretty fawns watched me curiously as they continued to chew their cud. I remember thinking that this man must be a weighty individual. As he neared his approach, the hefty sound of his footfall was thunderous, substantial, hefty. I likened the sound of his walking to an elephant thumping across the ground towards me, but an elephant pounding the ground on 2 feet, not 4, for these were distinctive bipedal footsteps, but very powerful ones at that. I remember thinking this fellow has got to be over 600 pounds or more to make the ground heave and vibrate like that. But then again, you wouldn't think a 600-pound man would have the physical dexterity, capability, or even fitness to be able to navigate his way through such a dreadfully rugged terrain, unless he was a bodybuilder of note, which would then explain his weight. I noticed a couple of the doe with their speckled fawns that had been watching me shifted their gaze towards the approaching stranger. They fearlessly bounded towards him, as though delighted to see him, like an exuberant puppy dog welcoming you home after a long day at work. That was when I saw him. You saw him, I asked. Who was it that you saw? Was there a man living rough in the woods? In a manner of speaking, Philly, I suppose you could say that. A very large man indeed. A Bigfoot, to be exact. A Bigfoot, I gasped. You saw a Bigfoot? What did it look like? I asked excitedly, hardly being able to contain my enthusiasm. Was it like an ape-man? An ape-man? Said Mr. Sawyer, looking at me through his green eyes in surprise. No, he didn't look like an ape-man. But I've heard that Bigfoots are like primates. Well, you heard wrong, Philly. The creature was most certainly all man. But are you sure, then, it was a Bigfoot? Of course I'm sure, Philly. The Bigfoot had the quintessential features often discussed in local reports. The pointed head, the overlong arms, the body swathed in very thick, long, dark hair. But then I suppose it would have to be thick and luxurious like that, given the winter weather here in Alaska, or the creature would never survive. So what makes you say it was human? I asked. The face, Philly, the face. It was so human, unnervingly so. As for the size of this thing, it was humongous. I don't think you can appreciate how huge a Bigfoot is until you see one for your very self. Even a grizzly bear would be intimidated by this thing, possibly scared off by it too, I shouldn't wonder. It was only after I saw this Bigfoot that I realized that this had to be Alaska's most dangerous predator. "That big," I gasped. "That big, Philly. That big." "If you were to guess, how tall was this thing?" "Oh, easily over 9 foot. Easily 800 pounds or more, but very wide over the shoulder area. Hefty, burly, muscular, powerful, strong, majestic, lofty. I could go on forever." "So what did the Bigfoot do?" I asked. "I watched him squatting on the ground on his haunches, fussing over the deer, as though they were his own pets. He was stroking them like you or I would fuss over our dogs. They were nuzzling him. Oh, they loved this Bigfoot much more than some dogs love their own human owners. And the feeling was mutual, for that Bigfoot loved those deer. I mean, he loved them. Heaven help anyone who hunted down one of his beloved deer. They would almost certainly be on the receiving end of that Bigfoot's wrath. I noticed the deer would go in and out of the woodland area, as they loved to graze in the alpine meadow, and return back to the wooded sanctuary. They were the most peaceful, relaxed deer, chilled out like you can't believe, that I've ever seen. But certainly with that Bigfoot looking after them, I ask you, what the heck did they have to fear? Nothing. I wouldn't mind the Bigfoot having my back. After fussing over the deer, the Bigfoot sniffed the air, and I knew he'd smelt me. I just knew it. You could see his large aquatic nostrils twitching, while his huge pyramid-shaped head swiveled around in my direction, until they were pinned on the very spruce tree where I was hiding, exactly where I was hiding. The expression on his face was far from happy. I've never felt so much fear, Philly, as I did then. I knew I was in grievous danger, real danger. I could smell it, taste it, sense it in the core of my being. I decided to take my chances. I mean, what did I have to lose? I surreptitiously backed away as stealthily as I could, but it was too late. In a second the creature had glided up to me. His breathing was heavy, his deep-set dark eyes fixed on me, studying me intently. His eyes seared through my thoughts as if he was trying to read my mind like the script of an open book. I watched in horror as his discerning eyes travelled up and down my body, as if he was searching me, like one of those detectives at the airport, until they settled on the rifle in my hand. Then his demeanour shifted, as fast as the weather. He became incensed. I could see the creature physically stiffen, his jaws tighten, his breathing intensify. I noticed the large, generous hands began to clench tightly. He then grabbed my rifle, bent it in half like that psychic Uri Geller that bends spoons backwards. It was nothing for him to bend my rifle in half, nothing. He threw it across the forest floor in a frenzied rage, where it must have landed amidst the ground cover there. I think he assumed I was there in the woods trying to hunt down one of his beloved deer. Of course I was planning to hunt, but not those deer, not in a month of Sundays. But the look he gave me was venomous, lethal. His demeanour was like a protective father that wants to knock the lights out of you because he believes your intentions towards his beloved daughter are not good. I knew in that moment I was in trouble, big trouble. The creature straightened out his torso, began to beat his chest as if he was lamenting. I watched in horror as his thin black lips on his dark leathery face rolled back to reveal these glistening white teeth. Then the creature growled at me, so aggressively that he would have made a lion's snarl seem like a pussycat. I say that without any exaggeration, Lily. The sound he made was terrifying. Even the needles of the spruce trees began to shake and vibrate. I don't know a time in my life when I was seized or crippled by so much terror. I was certain I was about to die. I wasn't going to get away from that creature in one piece. I knew it.
but I would die trying, as what did I have to lose? My feet felt like concrete blocks beneath me as I tried in vain to make my feeble escape, but I was no match for this creature. I tried to bolt away, run as fast as I could, but it was like I was an old car with a faulty engine that could barely start. I was begging for adrenaline to course through my veins, to give me that vital edge, but it eluded me. I was wobbling so much that my legs were beginning to buckle beneath me like a folding camping chair that had lost its stability. I was stumbling over everything, plants, vegetation, tree stumps. My balance was as precarious as a man on one leg. The angry creature lifted me into his arms, tossed me over his shoulder defiantly like a sack of potatoes, glided with me through the woods as fast as he could. He moved like the wind. I remember I couldn't scream, Lily. The lump in my throat was so thick that nothing would come out. I was so afraid, but I was resigned to my plight. The creature was going to kill me, and there was not a whole lot I could do about it. I just hoped with all my heart that it would be a merciful, quick death, and that my body would be recovered, as the last thing I wanted was my wife to have no closure in her life. She doesn't deserve that. I remember as the creature moved with me on his back, he literally floated. His movements were fluid, no jolts or bumps that you get with other animals. I've been a horse rider all my life, but this creature's movements were graceful, effortless, smooth. He smelt of the earth and dust, like our cat Bilbo Bobbins, who spends his life rolling in the dust in the summer months. The Bigfoot smelt like him. He was breathing exactly like a horse, but given his substantial size, and of course the oxygen needed to be transported around his body, I suppose that makes a lot of sense. Finally, he was gliding with me down the embankment on the side of the road, close to where I had been driving my truck earlier. Then he dumped me on the side of a spruce tree, as if he was offloading a large sack of rubbish for the garbage disposal to collect. By this time he wasn't particularly aggressive towards me, but his arms were so powerful, so when I hit the side of the spruce tree, I could hear bones breaking, snapping and fracturing. And the pain, it was unbearable. The creature looked at me, and in my mind I heard the words, "If you dare come near my dear again, I will kill you. I will kill you." He grunted, snorted, turned around, and glided away. Since then I've done some research on Bigfoot, Lily. It seems the indigenous Indians described them as the king of the forests, and there are lots of stories of Bigfoot protecting the deer, killing hunters who shot these animals for sport, but not those who killed them for genuine food. Only those who enjoyed robbing a creature of its life without using its body parts for survival. Those were the ones that the Bigfoot killed. "It's an extraordinary story," I said. "Do you think the Bigfoot wanted to kill you?" "Actually, no, I don't. He wanted me out of that wooded sanctuary, nowhere near his deers. It was his territory. But I think if I had killed one of his deers, I would almost certainly be dead right now, even as I speak. In fact, I don't doubt it. I know it." "But you're not dead, Mr. Sawyer, are you? You're alive and well. The Bigfoot didn't kill you. He just made his point. He didn't want you going anywhere near his territory. And you were discerning enough to know that the tame deer that you encountered should not be shot. And that revelation saved your life." Well, I'm glad to inform you that when Baron Sawyer began to tell me his story, the post-traumatic stress disorder dissipated as he came to terms with what had happened to him. He told me that the Bigfoot taught him the value of every life form on this planet. He has never been able to kill a deer since this event. "I cannot," he told me. "I just can't." So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Penelope Blackwood, and I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest. And when I got married to my husband Russell in 1994, we both moved into the double-storey cottage in the far left-hand corner of his parents' sizable ranch. Russell's parents still resided in the main 1800s farmhouse where my husband had grown up as a young boy, and they ran their horse ranch from the main homestead that was exceedingly well equipped and furnished with premier stable blocks and storage barns. There was a long, smooth tarmac road that led to the main house, with 2 signs, one that pointed straight ahead, which was signposted with the words Saddled Horse Ranch, and the other one strategically pointed down the fork turning in the road, which was signposted with the words Green Orchard Cottage. When you turned down that little rugged precipitous road, it led to our 1800s cottage that had belonged to the original caretaker of the land, along with his family in the 1800s. This delightful, charming abode was steeped and marinated in a rich, vibrant history that remained on the land like a long-lost, forgotten friend, vacant, neglected and unused for over 50 long years. So my husband and I had jazzed up the place, reviving, reawakening and recapturing its original essence with some fresh paint, whilst restoring some of the damaged ceilings and a few other little maintenance jobs to bring the cottage up to speed. We even added on a wraparound porch in keeping with the style of the cottage in order to be able to enjoy and appreciate the ravishing panoramic views over the pretty bridged creek, the mountains and the forest. I think Russell and I were secretly hoping to enjoy a spot of bird watching from that porch from time to time. Once the very moderate renovations were at last complete, the cottage was incredibly beguiling. It was like we had brought it back to life from the dead, like a blackened old silver kettle that had been heavily tarnished over years of forsaken neglect and had been buffed up to its former magnificent glory. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it would not have looked out of place on a box of Swiss chocolates, because it was so magical and enchanting, and was more in sequence with something out of a poetic, whimsical fairy tale than our reality. Even my husband would joke to me and say, "Where are the fairies? And the elves, sweetheart? They ought to be around here somewhere." I knew exactly what he meant, because if fairies and elves are real, our character-rich cottage would be the quintessential place for them to be found. The cottage was a white-bricked home with a stone facade and was heavily flanked by the most incredible dreamy alpine forest. These robust statuesque trees clung to the mountains on the rear of our property rather like oysters on a rock, covering them in a dreamy, verdant, bushy ombrage. On the right-hand side of our property were pretty flowery meadows, where my husband's father's horses would be trotting around the fenced-in fields and grazing the pastures happily. I loved watching those horses. It was such a joy for me. And they would often lean over the fence, hoping for an apple or a carrot from me, and they were rarely ever disappointed, as I was always willing to oblige them with a treat. Russell and I were exceedingly excited to move into this vibrant, beautiful cottage, and I couldn't have asked to live in a more appealing, romantic space that I had transformed with eclectic pieces of vintage furniture that were harmonious to the cottage's rich history. I've always been a very down-to-earth person who's never believed in ghostly phenomena or the paranormal before, but I assure you, the moment we moved into the property, I sensed a presence of, or energy if you like, in our home, but I thought I was going mad and was imagining things. Sometimes I would hear heavy footfall walking down our sweeping staircase, or I would turn around to look at who was coming, and there would be nobody there. Yet I could almost feel someone there looking at me. Was I going stark raving mad, I would wonder to myself, over and over again. Then there were of course multiple occasions where in my peripheral vision I was almost certain I discerned a fleeting shadow, but once again when I turned around to look, I could see nothing. If that was not disturbing enough, there were times when my golden retriever Carmiel would rise up on his haunches, wagging his tail profusely and barking happily, as if he was greeting someone joyfully, but we saw no one standing there. One day when I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes after dinner in the early evening, when it was still relatively light outside, I happened to glance outside the kitchen window and could see a man walking towards the bridge on the creek, which in itself was decidedly odd, because this man should have been nowhere near our property, as it was private land. But he was wearing clothes indicative of another time, and he had an eccentric-looking walrus moustache on his face, growing down the outer edges of his mouth, which was an unusual feature in itself for our modern times, and not something you most commonly see in our day and age. I quickly ran towards the lake, calling after the strange man, "Hi there! Can I help you? Sir, can I help you?" The man stopped for a moment and turned around, looking directly at me, with a warm smile on his face that was so charming and prepossessing. All of a sudden, his image just suddenly faded, dematerializing before my eyes like a vaporous mist, and 1 second he was there, and then he was gone. I was suddenly hit with the stark, awesome revelation and confounded realization that I had seen a ghost. I mean, what else could it possibly have been? I was so bemused and flummoxed that I kept saying to Russell over and over again, "Oh my goodness, I'm almost certain I've just seen a ghost." I was later to learn from Russell that he had seen the ghost of the caretaker very frequently as a young child growing up, especially when he'd been playing around the creek with his younger siblings. "Why on earth didn't you tell me about the ghost of the caretaker?" I asked him. "Because, Penelope, sweetheart," he had piped, "you are the most cynical person I've ever met. I knew I wouldn't convince you of such a thing as ghosts, so I figured out to myself that the caretaker would make himself known to you sooner or later, and only then would you believe. He's been haunting this land for many centuries, and everyone who lives here has seen him, and it was only a matter of time before you saw him too." "Why is he still hanging around here?" I asked my husband. "Perhaps he's attached to the land," my husband suggested. "After all, he was the original caretaker here. I've never got the impression he's unhappy or lost. I think he enjoys hanging around and watching over the place. Maybe he believes he's still managing the affairs of the homestead from beyond the grave. My father swore once that the ghost had woken him up when one of the horses was struggling to give birth, and thanks to the caretaker, mother and foal were absolutely fine. Another anomalous thing that happened in our household is that I lost things from time to time, like my reading glasses, for example. I would look everywhere for them, which was a regular event for me, as I can be rather scatterbrained at the best of times. Invariably, I would magically find them replaced on my pillow, and this happened with everything from keys to credit cards to even a small garden trowel that I lost once and couldn't find anywhere. As a result, I promptly decided that the ghost of the old caretaker, whom had lived in the cottage in the 1800s, was still taking care of things from beyond the grave, and I never regarded his presence in our home as unwanted or unpleasant. In fact, I believed his presence was welcome, as the ghost was more of a help rather than a hindrance. I gather his name was Gabe Beswick, and so if I sensed he was around, I would say, "Hello, Gabe." If I'd lost something, I would say, "Gabe, I'm missing my tweezers. Have you seen them?" Sure enough, I would find them later perched on my pillow. I think the ghost of Gabe rather liked me, because I promised you on birthdays and Christmases without fail, I would find a pretty wild flower or rose on my pillow, and this is still going on this very day. So my husband teases me relentlessly and tells me that my secret admirer is not of this world, and this is a long-standing joke with all our family members. My story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015, when my son Adam was turning 13 years old at the time. It all began when we decided to throw a fabulous party for Adam during the summer months, as the delightful weather was fabulously sunny, so it was the perfect occasion to host the most spectacular, wonderful party for him under the stars, along with a tented sleepover for the kids. My husband Russell hitched up a large tent for this purpose, and the guests were always asked to bring along their sleeping bags and pyjamas. Even a dance floor had been hired and was placed outside on the lawn, along with a pre-programmed stereo system for all the music. I do remember we lit up pretty paper lanterns everywhere to light up the entire yard. It looked magical and welcoming that night. There was a large fire pit and a carcass of lamb and pork cooking on the spit, and the delicious aroma from the food wafted over the entire countryside, ensuring that every single stomach was rumbling, and the people more than a little eager to eat the tender and succulent cuts of melt-in-the-mouth meat. The whole lawn was decked out with tables and chairs, swathed in white tablecloths with hot air balloons tied to the chairs. My sister Janine had arrived from Florida with her husband and her 16-year-old son Jonathan, who was staying with us at the time. Unfortunately, Jonathan was a belligerent, pugnacious and confrontational teenager who was always getting into all kinds of trouble and was rather a negative influence on my son at the best of times. On the day of the exciting party, My sister and I were preparing all kinds of delicious, sumptuous salads and dishes in the kitchen, along with a very large fruit punch made with passion fruit, lemonade, pineapple and orange juice, and ubiquitous pieces of chopped fruit. My son had insisted that this was the main drink he wanted to serve at the party, as it tasted absolutely delicious. "Oh, I sincerely hope Jonathan is not up to something mischievous and roguish," said my sister, looking at me ever so uneasily. "Have you noticed the way he and Adam have been whispering to each other non-stop all day and giggling? Oh, when Jonathan behaves like a delinquent and starts giggling all the time, I get a distinct chill down my spine. I sense he has a huge prank up his sleeve, and believe me, you don't want to be on the receiving end of one of his puckish jokes. It's a wonder my hair hasn't turned white from all the stress that kid's put me through." "You never told me any of this," I said, looking at my sister in horror. "What kind of pranks are we talking about, Janine?" "Believe me, you don't really want to know," said Janine. "I don't think I should tell you. It might scare you half to death." "Do I want to know?" I piped. "Of course I want to know, Janine. We're having a 13-year-old party, and the last thing I want to do is upset a bunch of overprotective parents whose kids have been scared half to death by one of your son's frolicsome jokes. I'll never live it down when I pick up Adam after school at the gates. I assure you, some of his friends' parents are stick-in-the-muds at the best of times. The last thing I need is to be assaulted by an avalanche of disapproving looks and underhand whispers, not to mention derogatory comments." "Well, wait until Adam gets to 16 years old," sighed Janine, "and then you'll see what I'm going through. I don't know, maybe it's just my son and his rampaging hormones, but his impish jokes have really been giving me some major scares. Last week I came home from my weekly shopping at Walmart, armed with my shopping bags, and as I was walking into the kitchen, this huge crocodile came sliding towards me on its belly, pushing its body forward with his clawed feet, and its wide jaws were half open, exposing its pernicious, perilous, razor-sharp teeth. Its large, jagged tail was thrashing violently across my kitchen floor. I was so terrified that I dropped all my shopping bags, splattering the floor with broken eggs and spilled milk. I ran out of there so fast, screaming at the top of my lungs, and Jonathan and his best friend Nicholas were almost wetting themselves, they were laughing so much at my frenzied reaction and frantic outcry. They really got off on scaring me half to death. It wasn't even remotely funny. I'm sure it wasn't. Where did that crocodile come from? I asked, looking absolutely appalled. I have no idea, Penelope. I don't ask him those kind of questions, said Janine, oscillating her arms in frustration. Frankly, Penelope, the less I know, the better, as far as I'm concerned. You're scaring me, I said. I couldn't handle it if he did something cocky and impudent at Adam's party. Oh, please speak to him on my account, Janine, I'm begging you. Tell him that he'll be on the receiving end of my wrath if he does anything untoward and inauspicious at this party of mine. I'm glad to say the party appeared to be going swimmingly well. Well, so I thought at the time, based on my seemingly ambiguous and pseudo-appearances that on the surface gave me the distinct overall impression that everybody appeared to be having a remarkably good time, dancing, drinking and eating to their heart's content. The ambience was very energised, relaxed and convivial. It would seem that the kids were piling their plates up with delicious food as if they hadn't eaten for months and were frankly half-starved. It also appeared that the fruity punch had been more than a huge hit, for everyone was drinking it with an unquenchable thirst, and so my sister made several more buckets of the stuff. I was mortified to see that my golden retriever had been given punch in his water bowl, but he seemed to have enjoyed it, which in itself was rather peculiar. It was only after one of the young 13-year-old girls, a girl called Abigail Fletcher, approached me giggling happily and slurring her words, that I realised suddenly that something was seriously off. Mrs. Blackwood, this is the best party ever. It's a great party. All of a sudden, She promptly vomited over my dress. I was now drenched in this pixated young girl's vomit, and in disgusted revulsion I promptly dashed upstairs, quickly showering and getting changed into something else. When I returned downstairs, I could see that there were several young 13-year-olds passed out on the lawn, clearly completely comatose, and this informed me that the kids had definitely been drinking alcohol. There was no other explanation for this outlandish behaviour. The kids in their spaced-out, intoxicated stupor were literally staggering around aimlessly and giggling at everything, finding the most ordinary mundane things hilariously amusing. 2 kids were pointing at my garden hose. "It's going to burst with water, and then we'll be wet." And they doubled over with laughter. Even my own sister Janine should have been ashamed of her behaviour, as she was about as much help as a boiled lobster. She was sitting on a sofa, seemingly inebriated, drinking copious amounts of punch, and telling me, this is really good, sis." She slurred between several hiccups and giggles. "It's really good." I so wish my husband and brother-in-law were on hand to help me, but after having carved the meat and set up the stereo system for me, they had subsequently made themselves scarce and gone away fishing together for the rest of the whole weekend. This was a complete, total and utter disaster as far as I was concerned, and everybody was bladdered, with one exception, and that is yours truly. I wasn't quite sure how to handle this precarious situation that was getting more out of hand with every passing minute. The punch had clearly been heavily spiked, and I immediately ventured towards the huge bucket to test it myself, and circumspectly tasted the suspicious concoction. That seemed rather fine. I couldn't detect any evidence or obvious telltale signs of alcohol, but I gingerly discerned a glass bottle surreptitiously poking out from beneath the tablecloth, and to my total dismay there were dozens of empty bottles of vodka that had been hidden from discerning adult eyes. How much alcohol had these kids been drinking, I wondered in horror. I knew who the obvious offenders and perpetrators of this juvenile, insidious, duplicitous crime were, and they were no other than my nephew Jonathan and my son Adam. However, when I went to reprimand both boys, they were as responsive as a pair of groggy, dazed, hibernating squirrels, and were lying passed out on the lawn, perched up against the tent next to my golden retriever, Carmiel, who was lying on his back, snoring loudly, exposing his fleshy belly. For goodness sake, even my own dog was completely pickled. Could things get any worse than this? I tried to arouse my ossified, bombed-out dog, but his eyes rolled back in his head and he glanced up at me briefly and began to snore even louder. Louder than I've ever heard him snore before. Although passed out, he did look exceedingly content and very cock-eyed. All of a sudden I felt a cold hand on my back, and it was so icy I felt as if I'd been hit by a blast of freezing cold air, which was very discernible as it was a very warm evening. I turned around to see he was trying to get my attention, but no one was there. And then in my ear I heard an audible, deep guttural male voice saying, "The creek! The creek! Get to the creek!" In hindsight, I vehemently believe to this day that this was the spectral voice of the ghostly caretaker, Mr. Gabe Beswick, alerting me to a potential problem on our land. Oh my goodness, I thought, and the horror and sense of foreboding that engulfed my very being was unlike anything I've ever yet experienced in my life before, and truly hope never to ever experience again, as once in a lifetime is just way too much for me, thank you very much. I could taste the sickly, bitter nausea rising up in the back of my throat. It was one thing for a bunch of 13-year-olds to end up 3 sheets to the wind, but it was quite another for a lone kid to fall into a water in a drunken stupor. This was not something I could have on my conscience, for if one of my son's classmates drowned on my watch, how would I ever be able to live with myself? I sprinted towards the creek, and that was when I saw him. There, standing on the bridge railing, balancing on it ever so precariously, as if walking on a tightrope, was a young boy called Christopher Markham, whose arms were held up high at shoulder level, and he was clearly impaired by his inebriated, mellow state of mind, and seemed to be rather enjoying himself and was chuckling under his breath.
I can fly! I can fly like a bird! Like a bird on the wind! I'm as light as a feather!
In that moment I was overwhelmed with terror. This young boy was about to fall into the depths of the water, and I was in no doubt about this in my mind. He was balancing so badly. It would only take a second. And then it happened, and he plunged into the water like a large stone that just sunk to the bottom of the creek. "Oh my goodness," I screamed. "Help! Help! Someone! Help!" I cried. "Someone please help me!" I was not a great swimmer, but frantically I ran into the water in all my clothes. Luckily it wasn't too cold, but it was very dark. I could barely see a thing, and I was as blind as a bat. I began swimming around feverishly, looking for the child, but I couldn't see him or find him anywhere, and I began to scream, "Help! Help! Someone, please help me!" "Where are you, boy?" I called at the top of my lungs, but the water was so still and quiet, and the only sound I could hear was the comforting, reassuring chorus of the crickets and the frogs, along with my own hands splashing in the water. All of a sudden, I saw this gargantuan, dark, shadowy silhouette dashing past me in the creek on a pair of very powerful legs, and then diving beneath the murky depths of the water with the swift speed, grace, and efficiency of an otter. In a trice, this strange, gargantuan creature, whatever on earth it was, had retrieved the young boy and cupped its drenched body in his chest, bringing him safely towards the dry land. Everything happened so quickly, but I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was staring at a Bigfoot. The critter's long, dark hair hung on his body in wet clumps, rather like a shaggy mop. It stood proud, tall and erect, on 2 feet, towering at the very least 7 foot tall, and possibly more, with overlong arms and powerful muscular legs. Its body was exceedingly long, lanky and lean. The chest was wide and heavily ripped with muscle definition and tension. I noted the head was shaped like a cone, folding seamlessly into the huge shoulders, and I did not discern any neck. The creature's face was not too obscure, as the light from the lanterns bounced off its silhouette, highlighting its prominent, pronounced features that were remarkably human-like, although the forehead was more sloped, and the nose very large and flat. As the Bigfoot put the soaked, bedraggled-looking child onto the ground, the child began to cough up water, and then bounced up on his 2 legs like a jumping jack, and promptly ran towards a bush, and proceeded to violently hurl up the contents of his stomach. For a second I locked eyes with the Bigfoot, and those deep-set eyes were so gentle and kind. I cannot forget how kind they were. The creature turned around, and then glided away. I could hardly believe what I'd seen, for I had never believed in the likelihood of Bigfoot existing in our reality before, but now I knew very differently, and he was my hero, for I seriously doubt I would have been able to recover that child without his help. I am almost certain that the wild, frenzied excitement of the party, along with the animated, jubilant chatter and cries of the children, the loud, blaring music, and the wafting, delicious smells on the wind of spit roast, had certainly aroused the Bigfoot's officious inquiring mind as to what on earth was going on my land, as usually it was very quiet. I believe he'd been watching us from the trees with an inquisitive interest and heightened curiosity, and when seeing a problematic situation arise, came to my immediate help, of which I'm eternally grateful, as I believe his discerning, perceptive eyes had watched our party rather like a movie unfolding, which he found a source of great entertainment, and the strange drunken behaviour of the children must have really boggled his mind, as it most certainly would mine. I threw out the rest of the seriously lethal punch, and I breathed a huge sigh of relief, as I was exceedingly thankful that the kids were finally sleeping over, as hopefully by morning they would have metabolized all that alcohol before their parents collected them and found out what exactly had happened. I was furious with Jonathan for lacing the punch with vodka. Truly, I wanted to kill him. All of a sudden, I saw a woman running towards me on the lawn. I groaned as I realised it was Alice Fletcher, who was Abigail's mother. She was the only punctilious mother who refused to allow her child to sleep over at the party. She was a very overprotective parent, and by the outraged, scandalized expression upon her face, I looked as if I was about to be challenged, antagonized, and even mauled by a very aggressive hyena who was determined to give me a hard time. "What the heck is going on here?" she piped, looking at me with an unpugnant, captious look on her face. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Penelope. What kind of a mother are you? These 13-year-old kids are seriously drunk, and even your dog is completely sozzled. How does that even happen? I'm appalled and disgusted, quite frankly, with you. Wait until I tell all the mothers about this. You mark my words, Penelope. No one will ever be attending any of Adam's future parties. I can guarantee you about that." "You don't understand," I exclaimed. "The punch was spiked by one of the kids." I said this not wanting to give her any ammunition to use against me, by admitting a member of my own family was responsible for this unprecedented chaos. "There's no excuse, Penelope. You're the parent. You should know what kids get up to and how naughty they are. From where I'm standing, you are definitely the guilty party. It's your responsibility as the parent to take care of them and to keep your eyes on them at all times. If they had been in my charge, I can assure you none of this would ever have transpired." "I agree," I confessed. "I should have guessed something was up, but I didn't, I'm afraid. The kids clearly pulled the wool over my eyes." "That's no excuse," she said. I watched Mrs. Fletcher gathering her daughter Abigail and glaring at me with a hateful look on her eyes. She marched back to her car, clutching Abigail as tightly as a child clasping its teddy bear for dear life, not wanting to be parted from it for a single moment. I'd never felt so alone, abandoned and forsaken in my entire life, and from that moment on, I decided I would never ever host a children's party without my husband on side to assist me. I had fallen apart at the seams, rather like a dress that had been very badly sewn together. Looking back over that party, I truly realised that I was incredibly naive at the time, in overseeing all these young teenagers, because you really do need eyes at the back of your head like a hawk. The party guests, including my dog, thankfully fully recovered from their alcoholic binge, seemingly no worse for wear. Many of the kids described Adam's party as the best party ever, which I did find rather extraordinary, given that most of their memories of the occasion were probably obliterated by the lethal punch that had knocked them for six like a powerful anaesthetic. Maybe they enjoyed the fact that they were given cake and ice cream early at breakfast the following morning, which I have to say went down exceedingly well with the children. I felt sorry for poor Jonathan, who faced my wrath. Of course, that happened when he was sober, and believe me, I laid into that boy as hard as a dog with a bone. When I told him that a young boy nearly drowned because of his wanton carelessness, that was a huge wake-up call for him, and in that moment he burst into tears as the horror about his little prank hit him hard like a brick to the head. "I could have killed someone," he wailed. "Oh, Aunt Penelope, I'm sorry. Really, I am. It was only a bit of fun. Really, it was. I didn't mean to harm anyone." I'm glad to say he's grown up a lot since then. I do owe a debt of gratitude to the ghost of the caretaker for alerting me to the problem at the creek, and of course to the Bigfoot for rescuing the drowning boy, whom I seriously doubt even remembers what happened to him and how close he came that night to losing his life. I must confess that the Bigfoot side of my story is still a big secret. I haven't told anybody about it, with of course the exception of my husband. As for Mrs. Fletcher, she ensured that the mothers knew exactly what had happened to their children at Adam's party and how intoxicated they had become. I did receive scathing looks from the parents for a while, but before long other parents began to have similar problems at kiddies' parties when they began to sneak alcohol to these events. So much for Mrs. Fletcher's famous last words, for she had declared that alcohol would never be sneaked in on one of Abigail's birthday parties. It would seem that the universe had a sense of humour after all, for it was at one of Abigail's birthday parties that the kids became seriously drunk, and so she ended up eating her own words, I'm glad to say. I'm relieved to say that after a while the fiasco of my party was soon forgotten, but for me it is an indelible event that is permanently entrenched on my memory, rather like a tattoo that is seared to the skin and can never be erased nor forgotten. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Gwendolen Taylor loathed her name with an intense passion and could never understand or comprehend why her parents had called her such a loathsome, old-fashioned, antique name that belonged in the history books as far as she was concerned, and was not hip for a 20th century name. Try telling that to her mother, who believed that life in the 18th century was so much more preferable to life in modern-day America, which she believed had become increasingly confused. She gleaned that people muddled through life, wearing blindfolds all the time, and were being forced to be politically correct, lest they should cause offence. People these days are far too oversensitive. Everyone's going around like a tortoise without a shell. You're continually expected to keep your mouth shut, walking on eggshells, lest something you say might upset someone. Society may have gone forwards with technology, but it's gone backwards in every other regard, and chivalry is dying a sad death. Men these days are frightened to even open a car door for a woman, in case she thinks it's patronising and condescending. It's such a dreadful shame. It's tragic. That's what I think it is. Absolutely tragic. In the 1800s, people were so much happier. They knew their intrinsic roles in society. I admit, women should have had more freedom to work back then, if that's what they so wished to do, and should not have been discouraged. But the sexes were celebrated for their individuality, and did not consider themselves inferior to be either a man or a woman. They delighted in their unique differences, appreciating that yin and yang absolutely need each other and are equally as significant. One is not better than the other. They are what they are. The fabric of the universe is both masculine and feminine. If we appreciate this, we'll all get along just fine, without waging war over feelings of inferiority. Gwendolen's mother had stiff, rigid views about things, and was the most stubborn, obdurate woman you could hope to meet. She loathed every known modern invention with a deep passion, which she viewed with a great deal of sceptical trepidation. "Fools," she would say. "Bloody fools!" She would wave her arms defiantly and shake her mane of dyed red hair furiously. "Wait until artificial intelligence takes over our world. Then we'll simply self-destruct. It'll turn against us, waging war against the human species. If you're human, you'll simply be obliterated. Even the scientists are warning against its potential threat. I'm no expert in these matters, but I can see the writing on the wall if we tread down that dangerous path." Gwendolen's mother's personality was as fiery as her hair. She loathed politicians from any political persuasion with a passion, believing they were all lower forms of pond life, with only an interest in advancing their own agendas. She would be every political leader's worst nightmare, for she wasn't afraid to challenge them with questions they did not want to answer. "So, Mr. President, can I have a word, please?" she'd cry out on various occasions when she went to political rallies. "Are you going to be raising our taxes? Please will you answer me? I'll have you know, hard-working Americans are tired of being pilferaged for their wages and exploited. You people are robbing us blind and should be totally ashamed of yourselves. All you're interested in is getting rich at our expense. It's disgusting, that's what it is." The political leader in question would hurriedly dive into his car for cover at Gwendolen's mother's outbursts and scurry away like a frightened mouse, while the crowd would cheer at her brazen confidence and shout out, "Lower taxes! Lower taxes! Lower taxes! Stop robbing us blind! Stop robbing us blind!" Growing up, Gwendolen's mother did not comprehend her daughter's aversion to her old-fashioned name that had belonged to many an heiress in the 18th century, and its meaning meant fair and blessed. How could anyone be adverse to a name like that? But when you rolled the name on the tongue, it didn't flow with the smoothness of milk chocolate, but stuck in the back of your throat like a prickly pear. The name made Gwendolen think of an ugly sister in Cinderella, trying to stuff her fat, gnarled, oversized foot
adorned with calluses and unsightly verrucas, into a perfect glass slipper, insisting that her fat foot would fit, because marrying a prince was her only hope in her sorry, sad little life. She was sure that her name belonged to the nondescript woman of the 1800s, whose parents took one look at their ugly baby lying in the bassinet and looked despairingly at each other, realizing their kid would never grow up to be a perfect rose. So they both said in unison, "Her name is Gwendolen." When Gwendolen was at school, she was bullied for her name, because her parents insisted it could not be shortened to Gwen, under any circumstances, as that would spoil the magnificence of the name. "It's like shortening Victoria to Vicky," her mother had piped. "Victoria is an exquisite name, so noble, so gloriously sophisticated. But Vicky, it's so dreadful, far too tacky for words." According to Gwendolen's mother, it would be such a travesty to shorten such an aristocratic name. Even the kids perceived Gwendolen's name was a little off-centre. They would sing out rudely to her on the school playground during break, some sticking their tongue out at her. "Gwendoline needs a dime, 'cause she is far from fine. Gwendoline needs a dime, 'cause she is far from fine." One of the kids even said, "My mummy says you have to be really, really ugly 'cause you've got such an ugly name." Gwendoline's teacher, Mrs. Farrier, who overheard the rude girl's protests, and having seen the cutting remark had hurt Gwendoline greatly, had said to the child, "That's not very nice, Katie. Gwendolen is a very pretty name for a pretty girl." The girl scrunched up her face in protest. "But it's ugly, Mrs. Farrier. It's an ugly, ugly, ugly name. You can't be princess. You can't be a princess with a name like that. My mummy says you can never be a princess with a name like Gwendolen." Gwendolen knew the teacher was just being nice, because her name rarely sucked, and she'd be a fool to believe otherwise. When Gwendolen returned home to her mother to tell her how much she loathed her name, her mother told her to stop being so silly. "You have a unique name, Gwendolen, because you're a unique young girl who will grow up into a beautiful, respectable and classy lady one day. You wouldn't want a common name, would you? That would be so unbecoming." "But Katie's mother said that I had to be really ugly to have such an ugly, ugly name, and that I could never be a princess." "Oh, you're talking about Mrs. Grayson and her daughter Katie. I know the woman well. She's quite frightful. Have you seen the short skirt she wears and the low cleavages on her tops? She leaves nothing to the imagination. She's a walking disgrace, she is. You care about what such a tart thinks of your name? Honestly, Gwendoline, why would you care about her opinion? The woman, dear, does not know the meaning of the word class if it hit her across the face with a baseball bat. Women like her you should always disregard. You can tell a lot about people by the way they dress. If everything is hanging out, you know they've got no shame. So why you care about her opinion, I honestly don't know. But I won't have your name shortened, Gwendoline," she insisted. "It's a very attractive name that I chose especially for you." Her mother could never appreciate how tough it was to be called Gwendoline. Thankfully, when Gwendoline reached her teens, she changed her name to Gwen, against her mother's persuasions, and never looked back. But the memory of being called Gwendoline haunted her. She had strong feelings about parents taking responsibility for the names they called their kids, as some could have lasting damage on a child's psyche, which was why when her 3 children were born, over 25 years ago, she had researched their names thoroughly, calling one of her daughters Sarah because it meant princess, her other daughter Rachel, which means one with purity, and her son Matthew, as it means gift of Yahweh or God. She surmised you could not go wrong with names you found inscripted in the biblical texts, and none of her children had been bullied at school for their names, which made her happy indeed. Gwen was well known in their small rural town in North Carolina by all the locals, and had recently become a much-loved member of the community, where she worked at a local charity shop, selling second-hand goods, which the money was donated to an animal shelter, and Gwen was passionate about the welfare of our furry friends. Gwen worked free of charge at the charity shop, enjoying doing her bit for the greater good, as she believed the more you gave in life, the richer your own personal reward was, and she felt a great deal of satisfaction from the job at the time. She was 56 years old, married to her husband Lucas, and they'd moved to the small town from Albuquerque 2 years ago, after their kids had finally fled the nest. She was afraid of becoming dreadfully lonely after her children left home, but she need not have worried about that, for her life in the small rural town had been very satisfying indeed, and she had made a plethora of good friends for herself. She and her husband had been planning to move to Maine, but on a serendipitous, rather random road trip in their RV, they stumbled quite by chance across the most charming small town in North Carolina, and spontaneously decided to lay down roots there. Gwen described the first time she encountered this town was like that strange feeling of coming home, and the irony her husband felt much the same about the place. The locals, who would normally be adverse to strangers descending upon their midst, like new birds trespassing upon the flock, they had welcomed the couple with open arms, as they felt so at ease with these strangers. By all accounts, the first time that Gwen walked down the high street of that small, rather bewitching town, with its quirky little eccentric shops and classic exterior facades, she knew exactly where the baker's was located and where to find the butcher's shop, and she had no comprehension on how she knew these strange random facts, even when she walked down the beguiling cobbled street, with its old-world charm and its street lamps. It was as if she knew exactly where she was going, as if an old memory was suddenly being reactivated. It would seem her husband was having similar bizarre experiences. Over and over again the locals would repeat, "Why do I get the feeling I've met you before? There's something about the both of you that is rather familiar to me." The words were becoming like a broken record for the delightful couple, and Gwen and her husband could make no sense of it at all. She promptly decided that all this outlandish, unfathomable familiarity was a serendipitous sign sent from heaven itself that they belonged in this prepossessing, charming town. Things were clearly meant to be when they felt right like this, much like a couple committing to each other in marriage, because they knew they belonged together. It was no more different than that. "I think we're like American quarter horses," she explained, "that have arrived to join the rest of the herd. And because we look no different to the rest of them, we fit in. That's why it feels right to move here." Lucas reflected on his wife's words, running his hands over his 2-day-old stubble, which he always did when he was trying to anchor his thoughts. Gwen liked it when he was unshaven, as when he kissed her on the cheek it prickled, which made her giggle like a silly schoolgirl. She considered her husband, even after all these years, to be a feast for the eyes. In her opinion, he was a remarkably handsome man. Frankly, it really didn't matter whether he was wearing a sack over his head or a smart jacket. He always looked great, and was one of those men that definitely improved with age, like a maturing wine. He had thick grey hair that refused to recede, bushy eyebrows that he kept trimmed because they would grow seriously awry, like a burgeoning vine with tentacles all over the place, if they weren't manicured regularly, along with his obtrusive nasal hairs that were equally as robust. Lucas had a square, handsome jawline and steely grey eyes that twinkled with humour, and Gwen loved his eyes, for they reflected a great kindness in their depths. "I don't know," said Lucas, as he was still considering his wife's words. "All I can say is I'm glad we moved here. For me it is like coming home. As to why the place is so familiar to us, honestly I don't know. Who knows? Maybe we visited the town once as young kids, and have no recollection of it. And as for being familiar to the locals, maybe we have a similar physical appearance to a family who lived here once. After all, you and I look a lot alike, don't we? You must admit, throughout our marriage people often mistook us for brother and sister, not husband and wife." "You know what, Lucas? You're not just a handsome face, but you make some very good discerning points there," she said, wrapping her arms around her husband affectionately and giving him a big hug. She marvelled how she loved him so much more now than she did when they first got married, over 28 years ago. It had been love at first sight when Gwen and her husband, on searching for a property on the outskirts of town, had first laid eyes on Honeysuckle Cottage, which in their eyes was like a cottage you would find written about in a fictional novel. But Honeysuckle Cottage was as real as they come, and looked like it had been birthed from a fairy tale, as even the front yard was littered with exquisite beds of English country flowers that were haphazardly mixed together in an organised chaos that had probably been masterfully designed, but looked like a tangled confetti of poetry in motion, where honeybees and butterflies floated dreamily from delphiniums to daisies and larkspurs, and then framing the small little property that overlooked sprawling meadows and distant groves of trees was the idyllic, perfect white little wicker fence that made the place look delightfully quirky. In Albuquerque, the family had lived in a modern apartment block with sterile fixtures and fittings. It lacked warmth, coziness and charm. If you wanted to escape that characterless, joyless environment, you needed to take a walk in the town, or walk the dog in the park, to escape the drab downness of the concrete monstrosity that they had called home for many long years. The soulless place had been designed by a visionless architect who had no prescient intuition or inspirational imagination whatsoever, and he'd taken minimalism far too seriously. And the architect, with his beige colour palette, thought all details were just needless fluff. Gwen was to realise she liked the fluff very much. She appreciated detail in architectural design. It proved to Gwen in no uncertain terms that office-like buildings did little to indulge our senses, that are always begging to be stimulated. So when you live in a place which is monochromatic, pedestrian and bland, you're going to crave beauty in all its forms, with a yearning of note. But Gwen had found this most certainly to be the case. In those days she was forever escaping the apartment to frolic in a green leafy park, like a free-spirited wild mare. Honeysuckle Cottage had it all, and it more than made up for the dull, dreary monotony of their former apartment in Albuquerque. The couple happily settled down to country life, with a zestful enthusiasm, and working at the thrift shop in town had enabled Gwen to meet all kinds of interesting people from all walks of life, and she thoroughly enjoyed every day on her job. It had been an unassuming day in early May, where although spring was on the precipice of being fully birthed, the cold days of the long austere winter still stained the early evenings and mornings, with the indelible reminder that the coldest months of the year had not been fully defeated yet. The promise of brighter, more sunny days on the horizon had excited Gwen prematurely, especially when the daffodils had burst into colourful bloom in great sweeping carpets of bedazzling, vibrant yellow, complemented by the flowering dogwoods and cherry blossoms, whose previously barren branches, naked from the long drawn-out winter, were now elegantly bedecked with blossoming ethereal blooms. It was easy for Gwen to precipitously conclude that spring had arrived, and she was presumptuously confident and rash in her judgment in this regard, so much so that she had impetuously packed all her winter clothes in a large trunk which she placed in the basement, far too hastily, to make way for her summer clothes. Honeysuckle Cottage did not have much storage space, as her wardrobe was ridiculously small, but she was to find out days later that the weather was so icy cold that she was forced to dig out her puffer jackets from their brief confinement in order to wear them again. Ostensibly she realised with a measure of great regret that winter had not relinquished its fierce hold over North Carolina yet, and was doing so very begrudgingly, so you could deceptively feel, based on just one good day, that the weather had finally surrendered to the vibrant cause of spring. But you would be very wrong in your assumptions there. On this particular morning in May, the day had looked inviting from the very start, so much so that Gwen was very tempted to wear a pretty sundress, but she knew from bitter experience it was better to be safe rather than sorry, so she wisely opted to wear layers of clothing over her jeans, which was a decision she would not regret later that morning. The sky was a beautiful cup of blue, and the fragrant early morning sun dappled the cottage in pretty shadows of dancing light. By the time Gwen reached the out-of-the-closet thrift store in town, the sky had significantly darkened, and grey clouds seemed to float menacingly across the firmament, wiping the smiles off people's faces with its grim sense of foreboding, as the small town was basking under this dimming light. In a trice the heavens opened like a tsunami, and it began to pour with rain. Gwen was glad to get into the shop in time, to avoid the deluge, as it began to bucket down without apology, and it looked like the forlorn withering tears of the sky were here to stay indefinitely. For many people they were completely caught off guard by these fortuitous showers that no one saw coming, that even the so-called savvy weather forecasters had failed to predict. But Gwen had learnt over the years that these forecasters could get their weather divinations horribly wrong, and so she'd never relied on their narratives. Otherwise, more often than not, she'd have left the house without an umbrella, and Gwen hated being caught in the rain. "Phew! Look at the weather, Gladys! It's raining cats and dogs out there! I'm glad I'm not caught out in that rain. I got here in the nick of time," said Gwen, looking out of the shop window onto the pavement, the parking bay, and the street beyond, fringed by large sculptural oak trees. She began to skillfully arrange the dog-eared selection of books that someone had generously donated, that looked suspiciously if some of the pages had been nibbled by an infestation of ambitious mice who had acquired a select taste for printed paper. Gwen arranged all the books in alphabetical order on one of the shelves, with the efficiency of a skilled librarian. "Well, I'm glad I brought an umbrella with me today," said Gladys. "You can never trust those weather forecasters. They get it horribly wrong all the time." The two women began to bustle around the shop, busying themselves with serving customers who came passing through, like ships docking at different locations. Soon the sun began to filter through the rain clouds, and a pretty rainbow appeared in the sky, as the dark clouds just melted away, so that the thrift shop became a great deal busier, as the bell above the door seemed to jangle all day long, and it seemed like Gwen had been run off her feet most of the day. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Gwen heard the quiet female voice. "Do you accept clothes from dead people?" Gwen looked up from behind the counter to observe a skinny, nervous-looking young woman with long, dark brown hair, peering at her short-sightedly. The girl had one brown eye and one green eye, but they were hard to see clearly, as the girl seemed to take refuge behind the sweeping curtains of her hair, where she could clandestinely hide herself from any intrusive stares, which was silly really, because the girl had not got anything to be self-conscious about. She was strikingly pretty, if she'd get all that hair out of her face, that was. She was obviously desperately shy, but if Gwen had her way she'd pull the young girl's hair away from her face to see her clearly. But the girl, as she spoke, refused to maintain eye contact with Gwen. "Sorry, what did you say? I didn't hear you." "Do you accept clothes from dead people?" She was wearing black jeans, a black sweater and boots, and seemed like a fish out of water in the shop, as if she'd rather be anywhere else in the entire world rather than this thrift shop, and Gwen suspected it had not been easy for her to come into the shop for some reason. Her long, thin white fingers were quivering as she held out a half-full black bin liner and stretched her hand towards Gwen, expecting her to take it from her. "My uncle died. He liked animals a lot. I thought he'd be happy if I donated his stuff for him to an animal charity." As the girl spoke, Gwen felt a shiver of dread prickling down the back of her spine, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up on end. Without any definitive explanation, Gwen felt her heart pounding violently in her chest, and she had the overwhelming sense that the contents in the girl's black bin liner she certainly did not want to receive, almost as if she perceived something was terribly wrong. But Gwen told herself very stiffly to stop being so ridiculous. This kind girl was donating her uncle's old clothes. The least she could do was sound appreciative and grateful. For indeed, without the generosity of random strangers, out of the closet would not even exist, and she wouldn't even have her job. She'd do well to remember that. "Of course we accept clothes from dead people," said Gwen, offering the girl a watery smile, as she politely viewed the ominous black bin liner the young girl was handing over to her with a degree of trepidation. It would be impolite to refuse anything donated to the store, but she could smell the manky contents of the bin liner from a mile away, and privately suspected she was being delivered a pile of dirty, very smelly laundry, and the thought made her shudder with disgust. Did people not comprehend that a thrift shop did not enjoy receiving soiled smalls and socks that smelt of cottage cheese? She had seen some bad things in her time. On one occasion she'd received a man's dirty adult diapers amongst his underpants and vests, and she had taken the contents politely from the person who was donating the stuff, wondering how anyone in their right mind could deliver anything quite so revolting. It had smelt as rank as a cat's filthy litter tray. Some people had no shame, it would seem. Did they really expect her to separate the soiled diapers from the underpants and put them on sale in the thrift shop? Did people not mind wearing other people's cast-off undies? And there was no way even a piping hot wash could wash away the indelible memory of that god-awful smell. On another occasion she'd received an old woman's dentures, a pair of buckled reading glasses, and a collection of old teeth. And then there was the occasion an old woman had donated a taxidermist's selection of rats that her husband had owned while he was alive, believing that someone else would fully appreciate owning the collection. Her friend had lined up the rats all over the front desk, and the moment that Gwen had seen them, she had physically screamed. She thought the place had suddenly been infested with rogue rats, until her friend assured her they were not real, but they were stuffed. "I just think I need to tell you something," said the girl hesitantly. "There are some of my uncle's clothes in the bin liner, but I've also included a very special pipe. It's a collector's item, you know." "Sounds intriguing," said Gwen. "We very much appreciate collector's items around here. I'm sure it will be in great demand." "It is a collector's item," said the young girl, lowering her voice so that no one else in the thrift store could hear. "My uncle, he worked in a prison, you know. He was one of the prison guards there. One of the men on death row gave my uncle the pipe. He wasn't allowed to keep it, you see, and he wanted his pipe to go to a good home, and he always liked my uncle. My uncle tried to refuse the pipe, but the convicted murderer told him he should never refuse a gift when it's given to you. So my uncle accepted the pipe. But after the pipe came into his possession, he was never the same again, you know. He suffered from dreadful insomnia and nightmares, you see. He thought it might be connected to the pipe he'd given, so he locked it away in a glass cabinet. It might be a coincidence, of course. You see, my uncle didn't judge people, no matter what they'd done in their lives, even if it was really, really bad. And this man, he was bad, and I mean bad. He killed over 15 young women, you know, but for some reason he liked my uncle. You don't want to get on the bad side of a very bad man like that, because that man killed 2 prison guards, but he always respected my uncle." Gwen raised her eyebrows. "Are you being serious? Your uncle knew a man who killed 15 women and 2 prison guards, and he owns the pipe that you're giving to me? Bloody hell! I don't know what to say to that." The girl appeared to enjoy Gwen's startled reaction. "I asked my uncle who the killer's name was, but he refused to tell me those details. But the killer did like him a lot, and asked him to keep the pipe safely. I thought I should let you know the history, because the man was executed by lethal injection. His last words to my uncle were, 'Tell them I'll be back. Tell them I'll be back, and I'll get them.' It naturally creeped my uncle out, which is why he locked the pipe up for all time's sake in a glass cabinet. But when he removed the pipe to show a friend the other day, to tell him the story connected to the pipe, as his friend was fascinated, he was found the following morning, completely dead, with strange bruise marks around his neck that looked like finger marks. The coroner said he died of suffocation, as if someone had strangled him to death, but my uncle had no known enemies. I removed the pipe this morning from the glass cabinet. It gave me the chills. I thought I should warn you, in case—" "In case what?" asked Gwen, raising a quizzical brow. Gwen was many things, But superstitious was not one of those things. She was prudently practical, and had no problem with receiving an old pipe that had belonged to a serial killer. So what if it had belonged to some unsavoury character in the past? It was just an obsolete material item that someone might like to own. Some pipes could be quite collectible these days, but people could be so superstitious at times. Still, it was a first to be receiving a pipe belonging to a serial killer, and if she was to sell it in the thrift store, she'd have to warn people of its unsavoury history. "Well, in case people are superstitious," said the young girl. "I know I am," she said uncertainly. "I'm living in my uncle's place with my mother, you see. We don't want it anywhere near us. It's a beautiful-looking pipe, but there's a message on the side of the pipe in Hungarian which reads, Ordak lovodul valvel nekem. It means the devil rides with me." Gwen shrugged her shoulders. "Well, you know, when people buy things from a thrift shop, they don't know where it comes from, who it belongs to, and frankly they don't really care. If it's a nice collector's piece, as you say, I'm sure the pipe will bring someone great pleasure. Of course it would be irresponsible of me if I didn't tell them what the writing on the side means, and that the pipe belonged to an evil man responsible for 15 heinous killings, but it is only a pipe." "That's my worry," said the girl. "Is it just a pipe? The Hungarians made the most bent pipes in the world. It's a beautiful piece of workmanship, I agree. It's comfortable in the mouth because it can be held in the mouth for a long period of time without becoming too heavy on the jaws. It's known as an umpole pipe, and it has a big tobacco chamber. But my uncle never used the pipe. He said it was a magnificent piece of workmanship and could be of great value one day." "Well, I'm sure someone will be glad to have it," said Gwen, almost choking on her words, holding the bag rather reluctantly in her hands with a vacillating hesitancy, knowing that the contents were incredibly unappealing to say the least. But nothing surprised her in the thrift store. The things people brought into the shop never ceased to amaze her, but a pipe from someone who had murdered 15 women and 2 prison guards, who had been on death row and executed by lethal injection, was an all-time first, and she wondered how Gladys would react when she told her the sobering news about who had owned the pipe. She watched the girl with the skinny legs and the long dark hair, walking out of the shop with a more confident swing to her step than when she'd first entered the place. She was obviously heartily relieved to have offloaded the pipe onto Gwen. She and her mother were eager to relinquish it from their home. She turned around briefly and gave Gwen a shy smile, and then she said to her, as she was leaving the shop, Please will you take care?" There was an earnestness in her voice that gave Gwen the chills, and then she promptly sauntered away. Gwen was still staring after the young girl in bemusement, as if she'd just had a bucket of cold water thrown over her head. She was trying to rewind the strange events of the last few minutes in her head, asking herself if it had been real. She trembled as she retreated into the back room of the shop, while Gladys gave her a warm nod, looking approvingly at the black bin bag in Gwen's hands. "Another donation! Oh, how lovely! What a sweet girl! Never seen her before a day in my life. Who is she?" "I'd be damned if I know," said Gwen gingerly. "I better go and sort this stuff out." "Well, go along, will you, Gwen? But don't be too long, because I'm going to need you out here. The rain has gone, the black clouds have retreated, and it's a sunny day. And when it's like this, we are so busy. So I will be short-handed if you don't help me. So be quick, will you? Don't you worry, I will be." Gwen grimaced to herself. She was sure that whatever was in the black bin liner was far from lovely, but she'd soon face the music of what the bag actually contained, and was pretty certain it would not be favourable. The pongy smell of dirty clothes was already tempting her to go to the back of the shop and dispose of the whole thing in the garbage dump, but that would be a very mean thing to do. It had been a strange afternoon. Gwen carried the bin liner to the back of the shop, tagging on a pair of blue gloves for hygiene reasons. She emptied out the contents of the black bin liner onto the sorting table, the words echoing in her head with an airy resonance. "Please, you will take care?" Once the stinking contents of the black bin liner had spilled onto the table, Gwen let out a loud, discomposing scream. Gladys came dashing into the back room. Her face paled of all its colour. She needed to see what her friend was screaming about. To hear her friend cry out like that left every single cell in her body tingling with trepidation, like the vibrating glasses on a sideboard. She was trembling as she ran into the room, holding a baseball bat up in her quivering hand, in a defensive, threatening gesture, almost as if she half expected to be throttling a perfect stranger who had wantonly slipped into the back room, launching an unsuspecting attack on her good friend. But no one appeared to be there. At first Gladys could not see what her friend was screaming about, and sighed with relief as her eyes skimmed the back room rather sceptically. Was Gwen not overreacting? They had seen worse at the thrift store before. Yes, the clothes were pongy, and they smelt of soiled, dirty linen that made you want to gag, but they were used to receiving stuff like this from customers, things that smelt of mothballs, damp, and everything else in between. But why would Gwen scream about this? It was then that she saw the large boa constrictor curled up comfortably among the clothes, looking slightly annoyed to have been thrown out so abruptly onto the table.
"It's a bloody snake, Gladys! It's huge! It's a big snake!"
The cold, rather aloof snake remained coiled up. It slid slowly towards the manky clothes to once again take cover. Gladys laughed. Her son had owned a boa constrictor once, so the slithering creature did not trouble her in the slightest, nor was she unduly alarmed. The poor thing was probably cold, she told Gwen.
"Maybe it was a family pet and crawled into a place to keep lovely and warm. The snake's not going to harm you, Gwen," she assured her. "Let me tell you, he'd prefer infinitely smaller prey than you if he was hungry. But I'm sure the thing did give you a nasty scare, and for that I'm very sorry."
"A scare? Are you joking?" said Gwen. She shuddered.
"Look at the thing! It's as scary as hell! The only time I want to see a snake skin is on a purse, but not up close and personal like this. I'm bloody petrified of snakes. Those slithering things make my skin crawl. And that thing just needs to crawl up onto my neck and squeeze, and I'd be a goner. And you're acting like it's no big deal."
Gladys burst out laughing.
"Oh, goodness gracious! Look at your face, Gwen! You really are a picture. You're very lucky you're not my son's mother. He'd have had a field day with you. He'd have slipped all kinds of frightful animal species into your bedroom just to watch the expressions on your face. I'm rather hardened to all this stuff, so he lost interest in pulling stunts on me a long time ago. But boy, would he love you. Don't worry about the snake, Gwen. I will deal with it. By any chance, do you happen to know the number of the sweet young lady who brought in the clothes for donation? You could phone her, because the boa constrictor is likely a pet of hers." Gladys picked up the boa constrictor and put it in the black bag with some clothes. She was not worried about it at all. "Now, failing that, we could of course call Tom Ellis. He'll give the snake a very good home. Leave him there for the time being in the bag. And don't panic. Remember, it's just a snake, for God's sake. It's not going to harm you at all." "I'm sorry," said Gwen. "You're right. I did overreact. But it's not every day I sort through clothes and come face to face with a snake like this. As for the young lady, she never left her details with me, I'm afraid." "That's an awful pity," said Gladys, "because I think the snake is likely to be her beloved pet. I'm afraid snakes get a bad rap. We'll get Tom to take care of it. And if the lady who donated the clothes pops by and asks where the snake is, she'll be able to pick it up from Tom. It looks very docile at the moment, poor thing. Probably very cold. You gave it quite the fright tipping it out on the table like that, as I imagine it was trying to hide out in a warm, dark place."
"You're worried about the snake," said Gwen gingerly. "What about me? Do you have any idea how freaked out I was, Gladys?"
"No more freaked out than the poor snake, I imagine. Those clothes," said Gladys, "they look to be of reasonably good quality. They smell rather niffy. We need to get them washed before we can sell them, of course." Her eyes fell on the rather distinguished pipe,
lying on the side of the table. "Wow, that is quite the most magnificent piece. I know quite a lot about pipes, and this is definitely a collector's item. Someone might really appreciate this. It's a beauty." She looked at the writing on the side. "Wow, I wonder what these words mean. They sound foreign. Or dark lavadul val vel nakem. How extraordinary. I do wonder what that means." "It's Hungarian. It means the devil rides with me. It once belonged to a serial killer who was executed on death row. Well, that's what the young girl told me. She and her mother want nothing to do with the pipe. They're superstitious about owning a pipe like this. The man was responsible for killing 15 young women and 2 prison guards." This time it was Gladys that looked confounded. For a second her mouth opened and closed like a goldfish, as if she'd lost the ability to speak. And then she said in a slightly quivering voice, "And you accepted this pipe in our thrift store? You are kidding me, right?" Gladys immediately dropped the pipe onto the counter in abject disgust, as if she'd been handling a dirty diaper, and hurried off to wash her hands in a mountain of disinfectant soap, as if afraid she'd been contaminated by the pipe. Finally she looked up at her friend, with a lopsided grin developing on her face. "Oh, very good, girl, very good. You had me going there for a moment," she said. "Getting me back for the snake, are you? You wanted to give me a perfect scare, so I'd fully appreciate the fright you had. Well, it worked. Happy now? You had me going there, you really did. Not even my son has succeeded in winding me up quite like that." "I wish I was pulling your leg, Gladys, but I'm not. Even I haven't got a fertile enough imagination to pull off such an ingenious, innovative stunt. The girl's uncle was given the pipe by a serial killer when he was a prison guard at a prison. The serial killer liked her uncle and wanted the pipe to go to a good home. So he gave it to her uncle. He kept it in a glass cabinet that was locked. Last week, the girl's uncle removed the pipe from a locked glass cabinet to show a curious friend. And get this, the very next morning, the uncle is found lying dead in his home, with strange black finger marks all over his neck. The coroner says he was suffocated and strangled. They're befuddled as to what could have happened to the uncle. He had no known enemies, and was the kindest man you could ever hope to meet, who'd give you the shirt off his back. Well, that's what the girl told me anyway. They're devastated about his fortuitous, rather suspicious demise, which is being thoroughly investigated by the police, but they're drawing blanks on the bizarre case." "And after the girl tells you this, Gwen, this incredibly outrageous story, you're telling me you accept this pipe from her? Are you completely insane? You should have refused to accept it. I'm sorry, but if it belonged to a serial killer, I want nothing to do with that pipe, and I doubt any of our customers will either. What the hell were you thinking, Gwen? You're one of the most savvy people I know. But a pipe like this, with a doomful message on its side saying the devil rides with me, is not something any God-fearing man would want to own. Things can have evil attachments to them, you know. Demons are real. I can vouch for that. And I want to assure you, Gwen, it's not to be sneezed at. Why do you think the Catholic Church is often doing exorcisms? It's a very real factor in our lives that should not be sneezed at." "With the greatest of respect, Gladys, I don't believe in all that mumbo-jumbo. I think it's absolute nonsense. But not everyone would think like you do anyway. Someone might be willing to give a sizable donation for something that was owned by a notorious villain. People like to own objects of historic interest and intrigue. You see it all the time, don't you, on those antique shows? Like an old calendar with Elvis Presley's signature on it, or a pair of dark glasses that once belonged to Marilyn Monroe. Stuff like that someone might want to own, for the curiosity factor. It could be an interesting conversation piece at a dinner party, when you're serving the dessert wine with the pudding. Hi, folks, let me introduce you to our Hungarian pipe, owned by a notorious villain, responsible for killing 15 women and 2 prison guards, who was put to death. You have to admit, that would not be a dinner party you'd forget in a hurry." "Are you kidding, Gwen? Why would anyone want to own a pipe? Such a dreadful pipe, with a grim reputation. owned by such an unsavoury character. Are you kidding, Gwen? Listen to the way you're talking. Why would anyone want to own a pipe with such a grim reputation, owned by such an unsavoury, vile character? Remind me never to attend any of your dinner parties, if you enjoy flaunting such grotesque curiosities. That would make Ripley's Believe It or Not look like a fragrant, sober walk in the park. Oh, by the way, the signet ring belonged to the axe murderer, and Freddy Krueger blew his nose in this handkerchief, and this is his leftover bottle of acne cream that you might want to use if you get a pimple. By the way, you might be interested to know that this toothbrush once belonged to Adolf Hitler. I'm sure you would like to buy it from me. Is that what you're getting at, Gwen? Because it's really not going down very nicely.
All right, you make a point, Gladys. I get what you're saying. I'm not saying that the pipe is everybody's cup of tea, but someone out there might appreciate it. There's no need for you to be so stingingly sarcastic all the time about this.
I know you don't believe in the supernatural, Gwen, and I accept that. But my grandmother always warned me, things have energy. And if this pipe has energy of any kind, based on who owned it before, it's not of the good kind of energy. Believe me, you can be sure of that. That serial killer who owned the pipe was executed for his heinous crimes, and he deserved to be, of course, if that woman is to be believed, and is not, of course, spinning you a cruel yarn just to scare the bejesus out of you, which I think is very unlikely. So if her story is true, and the serial murderer killed 15 young women and 2 prison guards, and you want to keep his pipe, I'm sorry, I have to draw the line there in the sand, Gwen. I really do. As a manager of this thrift shop, I must insist categorically there is no way you can sell this pipe to any of my customers. I'm sorry, but you can't. How could I live with myself if I sold it to someone and they were found dead the following morning based on my inability to discern that there is something seriously wrong with that pipe? I can't take a chance like that. It would be like playing Russian roulette with someone's life. Look what happened to the girl's uncle. He shows his friend the pipe one day and is found dead the very next. Try and explain that. I don't believe in coincidences, Gwen. I really don't. You mark my words, that uncle's death is definitely connected to that pipe. We need to throw it in the bin at the back of the shop, along with the rest of the donation the girl gave us, in case it's contaminated with a grotesque energy. Mind you wear gloves when you dispose of it, and wash your hands afterwards thoroughly. Do you understand?
Gladys, you're talking to me as if I'm a silly little shop girl with cauliflower for brains, who can't see reason if it's staring me wide in the face. I do understand where you're coming from. You're also making it sound as if the girl's uncle had a deadly infectious disease. He did not. And for your information, coincidences happen all the time. Maybe the uncle rubbed someone up the wrong way, you don't know. They murdered him possibly for that. Stranger things have happened. It doesn't mean that his untimely death is remotely connected to the pipe. In fact, the idea is ridiculous. It's a material object, for God's sake. It's like saying that the rack of coats over there is responsible for gunning down a supermarket of people. No one would buy that for a moment. Do you know how insane that sounds? If you were to tell people that, they'd think you were inebriated or as mad as a March hare. I admit it's an unfortunate coincidence, but it is what it is. There's nothing paranormal about that pipe. But if you want me to throw it out with all the clothes, I will do as you say and respect your decision. But I promise you this, Gladys, you're worrying about absolutely nothing.
I know, Gwen, that you don't believe in dark energy and demonic beings, but I do. And you need to at least try and respect my opinion on these matters, rather than appear to mock me as you're doing right now. I haven't made fun of you being afraid of that snake, so I would thank you to kindly do the same. Don't get me wrong, it was kind of the girl to donate that stuff, of course it was, and I'm sure she meant well. But I want nothing to do with this pipe, nor the clothes that this uncle donated. I thought I'd seen my fair share of abominable donations in the last few years here at Out of the Closet thrift shop, but this one takes the biscuit. It is to date the most appalling donation we have ever yet received. Everything about this day has been weird, and that woman coming into the thrift shop out of the blue this afternoon is weirder still.
I wish to God you had taken down all her details. At the very least, we could give her back her god-awful pipe and the pet snake that so happens to take refuge in a bag with a pipe and the logo on its back that reads, 'The Devil Rides With Me.' It gives me the creeps. And after your story about the uncle being found lying dead after examining the pipe, after he removed it from the glass cabinet, I'm sorry, but we could not pass this pipe on to anyone in case it's cursed or something. Look at me. The hairs are standing up on the back of my neck, just thinking about it. In truth, I don't think I've been more freaked out by anything in my entire life. In truth, I doubt I'm going to get any sleep tonight. My feathers have been well and truly ruffled."
"Look, I do admit the way the uncle died was strange," said Gwen obsequiously. "But I'm sure it really is just a coincidence and nothing more than that. I think you're just being way too superstitious and very, very sensitive about everything."
"I'm the manager of this thrift shop, Gwen, and what I say goes," said Gladys, with a surprising, indignant but stern tone to her voice. "Do it now, Gwen. Throw the stuff out right away. I will put the snake in another bin liner with other clothes until I get him rehomed. I am being deadly serious about this, Gwen. We need to get rid of that stuff now, without delay."
Gwen's account. It had been a strangely unsettling day at the out-of-the-closet thrift shop, especially after my outlandish, idiosyncratic encounter with a mysterious, shy, dark-haired girl with one brown eye and one green eye, and her earnestly concerned words, "You'll take care, won't you?" I was feeling more than a little discomposed and somewhat ruffled, like a pigeon who'd been almost eaten up by the family cat and had managed to escape with its life, minus a few feathers, and with its pride slightly injured. I was not the kind of person that got easily spooked or was remotely superstitious. Indeed, when I saw a ladder on the high street, I'd likely walk under it to prove the point that there was no such thing as bad luck connected with such items of woe. I realised in hindsight that Gladys was absolutely right. I could have been a whole lot more discerning. I should have declined the donation from the young bashful girl. But she was so desperate to donate her uncle's stuff, claiming he adored animals. It would have seemed ungracious not to accept the things he had once owned, as if I was rebuffing his magnanimous gestures from beyond the grave. I'd never been given to being anxious about much, but after my discomposing encounter with a boa constrictor on the sorting table in the back room, everything on that afternoon had grown from bad to worse. As if after the girl had arrived in our thrift shop, everything had gone from bad to worse. It was as if the in-the-closet store had been invisibly marked under a dark, inauspicious cloud of negativity, almost as if the whole upbeat, positive, cheery vibe of the thrift shop appeared to have lost its rosy glow. Many of the locals enjoyed popping into the shop, not only for a casual, brief natter, but to see if somebody else's second-hand goods might indeed become their treasure. But on this late afternoon, not even a solitary soul crossed the threshold of the store, as if something untoward was keeping them away. Since I'd moved to this small prepossessing town over 2 years ago, I had felt like I'd returned home, along with an incongruous, profound sense that I'd been here before. The only way I can describe it to you is if you plant a native indigenous plant in an alien place, far away from where it belongs, and then you return it to the place where it was originally grown. The plant stretches out its roots in the soil, sensing everything is right, the temperature conditions are favourable, the elements in the soil are just exactly like it should be. And my guess is the plant says, "I'm home." Even if it never grew up there, it senses this is where it belongs. It had been like that for me and my husband Lucas. Over the last couple of years since we had moved to the small town, Gladys had become my very best friend, and it felt as if we had known each other all our lives. We were more like close sisters than friends. She had invited me to join her in working free of charge at the In the Closet charity shop, and for me it was the perfect opportunity to make new friends and to get acquainted with all the locals, and the idea had worked like a charm. Indeed, if you asked any of the locals how long I'd lived in the town, they'd likely forget that I hadn't been there forever. Suffice to say, if you had seen us together that afternoon, you would have thought we were sworn enemies, with a major personality clash that struggled to get along. Not to put too fine a point on it, but the normally even-tempered, fun-loving Gladys had grown as prickly as a porcupine, and had been snapping at me all day like a cantankerous turtle, and she was one of the most serene, easygoing people I knew. But the rest of that afternoon in the thrift shop was one of the heaviest I've known on record. And it was all because of that damn pipe and a heap of smelly clothes that had been handed in to me by a strange girl. Since she'd entered the shop like an unsightly tornado, everything had gone badly awry. As a result, I was longing for Gladys to shut up shop, so I could safely return to the loving, reassuring arms of my husband Lucas, who would help calm down the storms after the rather miserable afternoon I'd had spent with Gladys. My husband Lucas could bring the light into a hopelessly dark situation and make you see it wasn't so bad after all. I hasten to say soon after the girl had left the thrift shop, the sunlight dissipated, and dark thunderous clouds rolled across the firmament, reflecting the tense mood in the shop. I'd never known the last couple of hours in the shop to be so deathly quiet, but after the girl left, it was as if everybody else had left too, which was peculiarly strange, and put Gladys in an even more foul mood. "Look how quiet it is, Gwen," she said to me accusingly, as if somehow it was all my fault that no customers had stepped into the shop. "I'm sorry, Gwen, but it needs to be said, and so I'm going to say it. It's not normally so deathly quiet like this. Ever since you accepted that donation from that girl, things in the shop have gone airy. I blame you, Gwen, for your poor lack of judgment in this case. I would personally never have accepted that pipe after I heard about its dreadful history. But oh no, you were swooning around that girl, treading on eggshells not to offend her, when you should have said, based on what she told you about the pipe, 'I'm sorry, but I can't possibly accept it.' I can assure you, an item with such a grim history behind it could not possibly be appreciated by any of my clients. It would be irresponsible of me to sell such a thing. You do understand, don't you? I'm not speaking a foreign language to you, am I? We are on the same page, I hope." "It's just a material object, Gladys, owned by someone with an unsavoury reputation. That is all it is. It's no big deal. Do you really want us to fight about this?" "It is a big deal," said Gladys. "Do you think it's normal for the shop to be this quiet? I'm telling you, the moment that pipe came into the shop, the place has gone dreadfully gloomy." "It's not the shop, Gladys. It's your foul mood. That's what it is. And the weather isn't helping either. It's gone overcast outside," I said, glancing out of the window miserably, sensing that spring still seemed beyond our grasp. "My point exactly. It was going to be such a bright, sunny day today. And that pipe comes into our shop, and the weather completely shifts." "Well, I did what you wanted. I threw the pipe and all the clothes away," I said to Gladys snappily. "Well, you've done the right thing. Well done. I'm proud of you." I was feeling annoyed with Gladys for laying the blame at my door about accepting the charity donation from that girl. She had blown a storm in a teacup that had been so reactive I was still squirming from the after effects. I'd never known my friend to be as thorny as a field of briars. If the truth be told, I was sure in similar circumstances she would have done exactly the same and accepted the donation, even though she denied it passionately. Let me tell you, at the best of times, it's very hard to turn away generous donations from people. But Gladys was blaming me for the pipe that thankfully I'd thrown away in the back of the shop, along with the girl's uncle's clothes. Throughout the day, the girl's warning words, "You will take care, won't you?" kept thundering into my head like a booming drum, and they continued to pierce my mind intrusively and give me chills that ran down the back of my neck. Tom had collected the boa constrictor from the shop, declaring it to be an absolute beauty that he'd personally like to keep as a pet. He was welcome to it as far as I was concerned. I was glad to see the back of it. Tom was going on and on about its magnificent markings. Personally, I couldn't see the attraction. As I watched him handle the snake, that seemed to be lovingly sliding over his arm, coiling himself around him as if Tim was his greatest friend. "This is quite some snake," he said. "Magnificent. I hope she won't be claimed. I'd very much like to keep her." At least we had one happy customer. I had dragged the warm, smelly bin liner to the back of the shop, where there was a large dumpster in the back. When I opened the lid, it was crawling with maggots, a sight unusual for early May, where I hadn't even encountered a single fly yet the weather was still too cold for them. But this dumpster had become a maggot breeding machine,
and it smelt as if a decaying corpse was lying at the bottom of the thing. But I did not want to investigate any further. I was sure it must be a dead raccoon or rat that had got caught in the dumpster somehow, and frankly, I really didn't want to know the details. I slammed the lid back down on the thing and raced back to the thrift store as fast as I could, as if I'd been fitted with robotic legs. I returned to the shop feeling deflated and rather sombre, and it didn't help that Gladys continued to bark at me throughout the day. She really was very indignant and rather angry with me, and I thought she was being exceedingly unreasonable. I think she thought I should have been more discerning about accepting that young lady's donation. But in all my time working at the thrift shop, Gladys had harped on and on about not causing our customers offence. "You must remember, Gwen," she told me, "when someone is giving a charitable donation, they're doing it from the goodness of their hearts. Even if they're inadvertently giving you a washing sack full of their grandfather's cheesy socks. We sort through everything and throw away things that are inappropriate. But it really isn't kind to turn away a well-meaning donation as far as I'm concerned." I had heeded her advice diligently, and was being treated by her as if I had committed a cardinal sin. I couldn't help wondering if the boot were on the other foot, whether Gladys would have turned this sweet, nervous young girl away, who seemed afraid of her own shadow, and I don't think she would have done so, if I'm being brazenly honest. When I returned home to Honeysuckle Cottage that night, I confided in my husband Lucas about the rather unprecedented happenings during my day spent at the thrift shop. He agreed with me wholeheartedly that Gladys had been exceedingly unreasonable towards me. "Honestly, there was no need for Gladys to be so unkind to you. You work at that thrift shop out of the goodness of your heart. You don't get paid for the job you do. I doubt she'd have turned the donation away if the same girl had approached her. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. That's the way I see it. More to the point, had that young girl not mentioned that a serial killer had once owned the pipe, no one would have been any the wiser. Think about it for a moment, sweetheart. Half the things they sell at the thrift shop, people don't know where on earth the things came from, or who the previous owner was of the second-hand goods that they're dispatching. If the woman had not volunteered that information, then Gladys would have been none the wiser, and would probably have sold that pipe for a nice sum of money." "My point exactly." Lucas put an arm around me, kissing me tenderly on the cheek. "People in small towns can be very superstitious, sweetheart. Don't be mad with Gladys. She's just doing her best to run the thrift store in the best way she can. She probably was rather freaked out on learning about the story you told her. But I'm sure it will blow over in the morning, and you will be the best of friends again. I like Gladys very much. She's a good sort of woman, but she certainly blew a fuse over that pipe. It's really upset her, but I admit it is quite a story. And personally, if I knew a pipe I was thinking of purchasing had been owned by a serial killer, it would give me pause for thought before I just dipped into my pocket to pay for the thing." "But why? When you go to a bar and you receive a glass of wine that has been washed many times over, you have no way of knowing who drank from the glass before you did. It's the same thing, surely." "I'm not so sure it is, sweetheart. But we could go around in circles discussing this. The main thing is you threw away the pipe, and that in the end is what matters. If I were you, I would put it all behind me. If you keep frowning like that, sweetheart, you'll have permanent furrows between your brows, and it'll make you look as if you're very grumpy, and I don't want you to look like that." "You don't think the girl was making the story up as some kind of macabre practical joke, do you?" I asked my husband, as I knocked back a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon to calm down the angst that was spinning around inside me like a Catherine wheel. "No, sweetheart, I doubt that very much. That would be a cruel, rather strange thing to do. What would be the point of that anyway? You said the girl was quite shy, so she would be even less likely to make up a story like that.
Maybe her conscience was prickled and she felt she needed to warn you about the pipe, given the ominous events that had transpired with her uncle. I think she did the right thing mentioning it to you. I mean, after all, people would like to know if the thing that they're purchasing had belonged to somebody like that. Still, I'm not sure many people would be eager to buy the thing if they learn about the history. But then again, I could be proven wrong. As you were saying to Gladys, it could be an object of curiosity to someone. You never know. People can be very strange. Anyway, let's move on from here, shall we? This morbid subject is really getting me rather fired up. Personally, I'd have loved to have seen your face when that snake fell out onto the table. I wish I'd been a fly on the wall. Gladys was right. It was probably just someone's pet.
Well, I'm glad you find my fear so entertaining, Lucas.
Well, you've got to admit it. It must have been quite funny to watch.
I'm not admitting anything of the kind, Lucas. It was a terrifying experience for me. The following morning I returned to the in-the-closet thrift shop, feeling like a wounded soldier that was expected to fight on the front line again, and wondering if I'd managed to walk away without feeling as if my world was falling apart beneath me. I didn't think I could face another day of Gladys snapping my head off like a turtle, and when I slipped into the shop I was almost afraid to greet her, but she gave me a warm smile, and my spirits immediately lifted. Gladys looked as if her dark mood had evaporated, and she was back to being her jovial, fun-loving self again. So the day looked promising, as if it offered the potential to become a very pleasant day indeed. By all accounts, things improved exponentially, and got to a very good flying start, when Gladys apologised profusely for me, for being so brusque in her manner the previous day.
I'm so sorry, Gwen. I don't know what to say. I overreacted about the pipe. It just freaked me out, you know. It just seemed such a bad omen, receiving something like that in our shop. But thank God it's all behind us now. And thankfully the bin men will have collected it in the morning and taken it 1,000 miles away from here, to some landfill site, where hopefully it'll be buried in the depths of the earth in some kind of grave there, and be remembered no more. We can sigh with relief, can't we now, and move on. You do forgive me, don't you, Gwen? She asked me, studying me with a worried expression in her warm brown eyes. I'm not normally so grouchy, as you well know, and I was a bit cranky yesterday, but you simply must understand that everything just got on top of me. I have a responsibility to the shop and everything I sell to my customers. I like to sell them the best quality stuff, and a pipe like that, used by a murderer, seems like an irresponsible thing to sell one of my customers, don't you think?
A bit cranky, I think. Oh, I think you were a hell of a lot more than that. In truth, I'd prefer to be around a trumpeting elephant than you, the way you were goading me yesterday. To be fair, Gladys, you really were outrageously angry, I said, determined to make my point. Most of the stuff we have in the shop, we don't know where it comes from. For all we know, those jackets over there could have belonged to the Italian mafia. You'd have been quite happy to sell that pipe if I hadn't told you who it had belonged to. You have to admit that that is true, and the girl might never have told me its origins. Gladys rolled her eyes in the back of her head. I can see, Gwen, you're determined to argue with me over this. Didn't I say we should just let it go? I said I'm sorry. Now do you forgive me or not? I don't want us to be at each other's throats like a couple of bickering seagulls. That is so unnecessary, and it's not us. I don't want this whole sordid business to come between us. You're like someone who's got a bee in their bonnet and just won't let it go, will you, Gwen? Of course I forgive you, but I think you made a mountain out of a molehill about the pipe, that's all. Let's move on from there, shall we, Gwen, and agree to disagree on this subject. Now, do you mind sorting out some of those coats that came into the shop last week? Some of them are high quality, I must say. Leave it with me, I said. I was glad to have moved on from the angst of the previous day. There was no point in holding grudges, and although I had forgiven Gladys, I still felt annoyed with her
I couldn't help it. The dark clouds of the previous gloomy, depressing day seemed to be a thing of the past, as prisms of bright, cheery sunlight danced joyously around the pavement, and people entered the shop with a genuine frisky spring in their steps, minus their puffer jackets and parkas. So perhaps the cold winter days were finally behind us. I could only hope. But I wasn't going to abandon my puffer jacket just yet, because if I did, like clockwork, the cold weather would come back with a vengeance, just to spite me. There was no sign of the mysterious dark-haired girl returning to search for her missing snake. The following day in the shop, things got outlandishly bizarre. So bizarre, in fact, that I had no way of comprehending what the hell was going on. Years after the event, I would ask myself, what really did transpire? But no explanations were ever forthcoming, and it was one of those things I'd have to accept that I'd never know the answer to. At the time, I was receiving a donation from a client, and this was an agreeable donation, the kind we love to receive at the thrift shop. As the lady was donating some designer clothes that no longer fitted her because she'd picked up a few extra pounds and gone up 3 or 4 dress sizes, owing to her huge weakness for Ben & Jerry's ice cream. "It's ever since my husband died," she told me. "I used to be as slim as a bean post, you know. I couldn't even put on weight, even if I tried. I had a fabulous metabolism back then. Or maybe it was that I just didn't have a desperate sweet tooth in those days. Let's just say after Rolf died, I got very depressed, terribly sad, you know. I'd lie there on my bed, crying and crying. I missed my husband so terribly. Nothing prepares you for a loss like that. One day I went to the grocer's and returned home with a couple of containers of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I think I bought Americone Dream or something like that, and strawberry ice cream, and oh my God, it was so good. It melted on the tongue, literally slipped down the back of my throat, and made the world a much better place. Instead of lying on my bed doing nothing, staring up at the ceiling, wishing I was dead, and feeling desperately sorry for myself, the sweet creaminess of that delicious ice cream lifted my spirits exponentially like nothing else I know. I became inspired. I wanted to live again. Whatever they may say about sugar and fat, it can revive a dying woman. I'm testimony to that fact. It did that for me. I took the dog for a walk, watched Netflix on my phone, went to visit a good friend of mine who nearly passed out with shock to see me standing there on her doorstep. She thought I was wallowing in my lugubrious melancholia. I literally came out of my shell. I'm telling you, those Ben & Jerry's ice creams made my grief more bearable. I even wrote to the manufacturers, you know, and told them, "You saved my life." They responded in kind by sending me a free voucher for over 100 of their ice creams. These days I try to limit the amount of Ben & Jerry's I eat, because I don't want to end up the size of a pot-belly pig. But the damage has been done. At my age, let's just say it's impossible to shift the extra weight. My metabolism is not what it used to be. But I've never been able to fit into those skinny clothes ever again. More's the pity. But guess what? I don't actually care a jot. These days I've got bigger things in my life to worry about than what size my butt is. So what if I'm a few clothes size larger than what I was? Anyway, I didn't want these gorgeous designer pieces of mine to go to waste. That would be a dreadful pity. So I thought, why not donate them to someone less fortunate than myself, who might enjoy wearing some of these pieces that otherwise they'd never be able to afford to buy themselves. "They're really lovely," I admitted, sifting through her designer creations. "You've got excellent taste in clothes. And that is quite some story. You should be advertising Ben & Jerry's on television. I think on my way back home from work, I'm going to have to pick up a tub, based on what you're telling me. In terms of the size thing, it happens to us a lot here at the in-the-closet thrift store. Getting people's clothes that they've outgrown. It's a common thing." "Well, that's a polite way of putting it, isn't it?" said the lady. "Gwen! Gwen, where are you? Please come over here right now," came Gladys's voice. "Excuse me a moment." My colleague is calling me." The woman nodded. "I think that is my cue to go. I hope someone enjoys the clothes." "I'm sure they will. Thank you, Mrs. Harris, very much." "Only a pleasure, my dear. Only a pleasure." "Gwen, get over here right now," said Gladys. Her face had gone red. The tone of her voice was far from amused. Indeed, it had sounded as if she wanted to kill me. Don't tell me her ugly mood from the day before yesterday had suddenly reappeared. "Get over here now, Gwen," she called out to me again, and I could hear an anger rising in her voice. I hurriedly dashed over to the counter, wondering what all the fuss was about, and that was when I saw a short, stocky man standing there. He had a thick neck, bald, shiny head, thick, bushy black eyebrows that framed his piercing blue eyes. He was pointing to me rather rudely, with his short, stumpy fingers. "That's right, that's her, that was her. She sold me the pipe yesterday," he said, throwing the pipe at Gladys, where it landed inches away from her on the countertop, with a powerful pinging sound. I was confounded and disquieted to see the pipe again. It had made an unfortunate reappearance. I thought I'd thrown it away in the dumpster the previous day at Gladys's command, as she was claiming she wanted nothing more to do with it. "That bloody pipe that you sold me, lady, it nearly killed me last night. Something was trying to suffocate me in my bloody bed while I was sleeping, or more to the point, someone. I got a glimpse of a very evil face. It was like a gargoyle. Never seen anything so hideous in my life. But my hand went right through him. But his hands were firmly around my throat, and I could physically feel them. He was squeezing me. I thought I was going to die. My wife saw the whole bloody thing transpire. She was helpless to set me free from this entity. I'm telling you, it's bad, very bad. And he mentioned the pipe, something about me stealing his pipe or something. There's something demonical about it. Even as I speak, there is a priest at our home blessing the place. I thought I would return the pipe to you, and my advice is to get rid of the bloody thing and to send it back to where it came from. It's your responsibility now, not mine. I cannot have that thing anywhere near my home." "Is this true, Gwen?" said Gladys, looking at me grimly, with a told-you-so expression on her face, as if I was a naughty schoolgirl that she wanted to reprimand for insubordinate behaviour. "Did you sell this man here the pipe? I thought I told you to dispose of that pipe in the bin outside. I made that very clear, Gwen, that you were to get rid of it. And the clothes that the woman donated, have you put them in the store as well? Have you sold them to other people? I told you not to do that. Why did you go against all my advice?" I stared in confoundment at the pipe, and then at the strange man. I'd never seen him a day before in my life, and I'd thrown the pipe in the dumpster the day before yesterday. I recall doing it very clearly. "I would certainly have remembered if I had sold it to this gentleman," I assured Gladys obsequiously. I was wondering why the man was lying about my selling the pipe to him. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know what's going on. I did throw the pipe in the bin the day before yesterday, and I certainly did not sell this pipe to you. Absolutely not. I've never seen you before, sir, with the greatest of respect." The man's brows furrowed together. It scrunched up his entire face. "I'll have you know, madam, you sold me this pipe yesterday," he insisted. "I remember that clearly. I don't know why your memory is so vague. I was here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon precisely, in the thrift store. You told me this pipe was a rare treasure, and that I was very fortunate to get to buy it at such a fabulous price. I will have you know I want nothing more to do with it. The moment I brought it home, bad things began to happen." He opened his collar to reveal some dark finger marks around his neck. "Look at this. If you think I'm making this up, explain this to me. What do you see here? They're finger marks. This was where I was squeezed last night, within an inch of my life." I stared in abject disbelief. There were indeed dark finger marks around the man's neck, as if someone had attempted to strangle him. "Now do you believe me, or do you doubt my story? Someone tried to strangle me last night. It was a demonical entity, I will say that. I wish to God you weren't lying to me, madam. I remember you sold me this pipe yesterday. You were very enthusiastic about it. You were wearing a pink cashmere sweater with pearl buttons down the middle. Anyway, I'm going," said the man. "I shall never be buying anything from the thrift store again, with the greatest of respect. If you want my opinion, you need to check out who you get your second-hand stuff from before you put it up for sale. You can't be too careful, you know."
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliver, for bringing this dreadful situation to our attention. I think you're absolutely right. We're going to have to be a lot more discerning about whose stuff we actually put up in the shop for sale. I honestly don't know what to say. I can't believe what happened to you. Please accept my greatest apologies.
"It's not necessary, but get rid of that pipe if you want my advice."
After the man had left, Gladys gave me a defiant glare. "See," she told me, "you can't tell me it's a coincidence that the man was strangled last night. It has absolutely everything to do with that bloody awful pipe. Why you went behind my back to sell it to a customer, Gwen, I honestly don't know. That was a sneaky thing of you to do. And to lie straight-faced to that man. You should be ashamed of yourself. I told you it would bring nothing but trouble. But you would not listen, would you? If you weren't my very good friend, I'd tell you to bugger off. But I will overlook this just for once. But in the future, when I tell you to get rid of something, I would really appreciate it if you would listen, Gwen. You can be so bloody-minded at times, thinking you have the answer and the solution to everything. You really did think that pipe was a collector's item, didn't you? And you really could not bear to throw it away. It was too much for you. So behind my back you go selling this person's stuff, when I strictly told you not to do it, and I am the manager of this store. You're not running it. I'm in charge. I'd like you to remember that." Gladys, listen to me, will you? I threw the pipe away in the dumpster yesterday like I told you I did, with those clothes. I never sold them to that man. Either he is lying or something really weird is going on here, which I can't explain.
"What were you wearing yesterday, Gwen? Remind me."
"A cashmere sweater, pink it was, with pearl buttons down the middle. That man could not have known that if he wasn't here yesterday. How could he have returned the pipe if one of us had not sold it to him? And I would never have sold him that pipe. So you did, and you know you did, and I wish you wouldn't lie." "If I did sell it, Gladys, I have no memory of it whatsoever. I must have been in some kind of trance. That's the only explanation I have."
"Look, Gwen, as long as you get rid of that bloody pipe, that's all I care about now. My advice is you do it now. I don't want the thing anywhere near this shop."
I stared at the pipe, as if it was my bitter enemy. It was lying on the table, and begrudgingly, very reluctantly, with a vacillating hesitancy, I put it in my purse. I'd have to ask my husband what should be done with the thing. He'd know exactly what to do. I was sure if I put it in the dumpster, another person would claim I'd sold it to them, and Groundhog Day would play itself all over again in my life. And worse still, Gladys would be thinking I was determined to sell the pipe behind her back out of sheer spite, like a disgruntled employee determined to wind up my boss. It would only serve to sour our friendship for good, and I couldn't allow that to happen. My former scepticism about things that go bump in the night had withered away, like a dying flower in the meadow. Now I was convinced that not only was the pipe cursed, but a demonical entity was attached to the thing. I do remember the girl with the long dark hair and the different-coloured eyes had distinctly told me that the killer on death row had declared to her own uncle,
"Tell them I'll be coming back. I'll be coming back, and I'll get them."
Could his spirit be behind the strange black marks on the man's neck? I was now beginning to really regret accepting the pipe from the young girl.
It was my responsibility to get rid of the damn thing, but it was freaking me the hell out, and I was becoming almost as paranoid as Gladys had been. But I refused to show her my disquiet, and assured her that I had got rid of the pipe. I knew she did not buy my story about throwing the pipe away, and thought I had deliberately sold it to a customer. There was no point in convincing her otherwise, as it would only provoke another argument between the two of us. When I returned home that evening, and told Lucas the very bizarre story, he was more than a little discomposed. He studied the pipe closely, affirming that the writing on the side of the pipe in Hungarian did indeed mean "the devil rides with me." For the first time I could see a horrified look appearing on his face. "I'll phone the pastor in the morning," he told me, "but in the meantime I will lock the pipe up in my toolbox and leave it in the yard shed. Everything will be fine, I am most sure. After all, when the pipe was safely locked away in a glass cabinet, it didn't do anyone any harm, so we should do the same." My husband had a good point, and I felt certain that if the pipe was safely locked away, no harm would befall us. Throughout the day a dark cloud of negativity had hung around me, as I inwardly fretted about what I was going to do about the pipe. I felt as if I was harbouring a stick of dynamite in my purse that had the potential to explode in my face. But now the pipe was locked away, I felt a huge measure of relief. I could finally relax. Gladys had noticed that I had looked a little peaky and on edge all day, and had kindly tried to encourage me, but had no way of appreciating the turmoil I was privately going through. "Look, Gwen, I don't blame you for what happened. You really did believe the pipe was benign, didn't you? It was freaky to see what happened to that poor man, and yes, I suspect it was connected to the pipe. But please, sweetheart, don't blame yourself. You thought the pipe was harmless. You sold it to the man to make a good point to me, and I get it. I'm not mad at you. All is forgiven and forgotten. The main thing is if the man is fine and his house is now being cleansed by a priest. You've thrown the pipe away, so let's move on, shall we? As I keep telling you, all is forgiven and forgotten. You're my very best friend. We won't let this little shenanigans come between us, surely." I knew better than to tell Gladys the truth. She didn't handle stress terribly well, and if she realised that I had not sold the pipe to that man, she'd probably be feeling very unsettled and discomposed. So I kept the details of the matter to myself. That night when I returned to bed, I felt as if a load had been lifted off my mind. Thank God the pipe was finally locked up in a safe place in my husband's toolbox in the yard shed. I could breathe a huge sigh of relief. I knew my husband would find a solution for us. I sank back gratefully into the sumptuous cosy folds of my feathery goose-down pillows, with a huge measure of relief, after having swallowed a couple of aspirins to eliminate the throbbing headache in the back of my skull, which had been brought on by the day's stress. But thankfully it was beginning to subside, and the warm banana milk my husband had brought me helped wage war against my migraines with an incredible efficiency. It certainly worked like a treat. My husband would whiz warm milk, bananas and honey together in a food processor, and my headache would magically dissipate. My husband had been taught this neat trick by a master of natural medicine, who swore the potassium and sugar in the bananas deflated the gas in a migraine headache. I'm not suggesting it would work for other people, but it worked for me. Before long I had slipped away into a peaceful slumber, grabbing on to the restful tranquillity it brought me, with a fervent hunger. I needed my beauty sleep more than ever before, as the inauspicious events over the last 48 hours or so had robbed me of all my peace, filling my entire body with a nervous disquiet, the likes of such I'd never experienced before or since. I knew from now on that at the in-the-closet thrift shop I'd be more discerning about any donations that I chose to accept. If I had known where the young lady with the dark hair lived, I would have returned the pipe back to her in a heartbeat and suggested she kept it permanently locked up in their glass cabinet. But in my husband's locked-up toolbox in the outside yard shed, well, that was the next best thing. It was later that night that I awoke up to hear a loud roaring sound. I was caught up in a dreamy state, but as I shook the sleepy slumber away from me and sat up, I heard the roar again. It was an angry sound. I remember thinking, what is that? You would think with everything that had transpired to me of late that I would be consumed with a dreadful fear and foreboding, but I was more curious than afraid. I'd never heard a sound like that before, apart from on wildlife documentaries. Truly, it sounded as if a virile male lion was in our backyard, making his presence known to every other male lion in the territory. It was more than a little bizarre, to say the least, to hear a noise like that in North Carolina, of all places, where lions are not indigenous to the natural habitat here. But the sound was exactly the same as a lion's. I decided I needed to investigate the sound, especially when I heard it yet again. If I didn't know any better, I'd think I was camping out in the wilds of Africa, hearing the distant roars of lions. Only this was way too close for comfort, as if the sound was coming from outside our cottage. I was dumbfounded to see that my husband had not woken up to those roaring sounds. You'd think he'd have bounced out of his dreams faster than a kangaroo. He was blissfully fast asleep, oblivious to what was going on. I discerned he would not thank me for waking him up. But something was out there. The question was what? I climbed out of bed with a measure of trepidation, mixed with a burning sense of inquisitiveness. The Arctic air in our bedroom was frosty, and climbing out of my bed, I was hit with an uncongenial pair of cold hands. I instinctively reached out for my dressing gown that was lying over the upholstered chair near the small little fireplace. I slipped my arms gratefully into the warm, very cosy fabric, and slipped my feet into my slippers. The bedroom looked like it was a soupy tea colour, so I could see my way around, as we keep night lights on throughout the cottage, so we can navigate our way throughout our home without switching on intrusive bright lights that can be terribly blinding when you're in a sleep-induced state. A chill ran down my spine when I heard the roaring sound again. I tiptoed cautiously and very discreetly down the rather creaking staircase. Soon I was trudging down the passage and had entered the kitchen. All the blinds in the kitchen were wide open, so the moonlight trickled magnanimously through the windows, and the tenebrific night from beyond the kitchen was less intimidating, as I could see the silhouettes of the trees and discern the natural environment, even if it was rather ambiguous. What I did next surprised even me, and I certainly would not recommend that others do the same if they were to hear such a powerful roaring sound. But it was so close to the cottage, I simply had to find out what it was. The roars began again, and I found myself slipping out of the cottage with a fire poker in my hand, not really considering the danger I could potentially find myself in. A wiser, more astute person would have remained locked up safely in their home, but I had abandoned my wisdom, as if it was an old overcoat that I did not want to wear. I moved clandestinely towards the roaring sound. It appeared to be coming from the yard shed, where my husband had stored the strange Hungarian pipe. But at that time, in the muddled state of my confusion, I never even thought about the pipe. My mind was finely tuned in to that sound. Every cell in my body was standing up in attention with a pronounced sensitivity, and I could pick up a furious energy in the atmosphere, and soon I found myself standing behind the outbuilding that overlooked the shed. I clung to the wall like a burgeoning creeper and peered around the side of the wall very cautiously. I shut my eyes tightly and held my breath. I was frightened about what I would soon see. The roar was so loud and so close it almost knocked me off balance and vibrated through me like a booming drum in a heavy metal band. What I saw next was staggering. There are no words to describe it. In the backyard I observed this huge humanoid silhouette of a gargantuan beast, with a human-like appearance, covered with long, flowing dark hair, and a face that was like an Indian warrior. This powerful beast was roaring like a lion, and he was irate. Even the sounds of crickets and frogs remained mute, not daring to perforate the veil of this discomposing energy that immediately commanded your respect. I could feel his anger pierce the darkness with the violence of a very feisty windstorm that can tear structures apart without much restraint. This powerful beast was easily over 9 foot tall, possibly more, built with the robust indestructibility of a bulletproof army tank. There was a wild wind blowing against my skin, and its icy fingers brushed abrasively against my face. I didn't feel it. I remained rooted to the spot, staring at this absurd creature, in total confoundment and wondrous awe. For despite the creature's daunting appearance, there was something so magisterial, so lordly about his gait. And that was when it hit me, like a sharp slap across the face. The creature was a Bigfoot. Oh my God! It was a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. The ambiguous shadow of this obscure, lofty beast was so intimidating that everything inside me went completely numb, as if all my fears, anxieties, and stresses had been anaesthetized. I stood there, as if in a trance, watching everything unfold before me as if observing a silent movie, and wondering what the hell this idiosyncratic creature was actually doing, roaring in our backyard. What could it mean? What did it represent? Was he trying to tell other Bigfoots in the area that this was his territory, to stay the hell away? I couldn't be sure. I watched him slamming his chest in a gesture of rebellious defiance, almost as if he was saying, "Don't you mess with me!" He was oscillating his arms in the air, as if he was meeting up with some indiscernible microscopic confrontational resistance, and was punching it out of the way, as he fisted it with his powerful hands, as if he was attacking a foe that was not physically discernible to the naked eye, but was clearly very visible to him, almost as if he could see things in our world others could clearly not. Weirder still was when he hit this invisible thing, whatever in God's name it was. It sounded like he was punching something seriously solid. The Bigfoot appeared to be winning this fight. The pewter-grey sky, bespeckled with the magnanimous prisms of moonlight, enabled me to see every obscure feature of his face clearly, and there was something so noble about this giant of the woods that appeared to have supernatural abilities that simply blew my mind. He roared again, and with a powerful foot and one kick, the door of the yard shed came crumbling down. It was flung off its hinges. Moments later, the sky was being littered with yard forks and spades that flew in the air for a moment and were flung all over the place indiscriminately, like scaffolding that breaks away from a building. They hit the ground with a mighty thunderous crash, like pieces of steel confetti. I realized what he was doing, although I couldn't make sense of it at all. This doggedly determined Bigfoot had grabbed my husband's locked toolbox that contained the Hungarian pipe that had once belonged to a serial killer. He shook its contents rigorously, like a baby's rattle, flinging it onto the ground so violently hard that it broke apart. The lock had been fully shredded, and the contents spilled out onto the ground. It would seem all kinds of tools, from screwdrivers to wrenches, were laying scattered all over the grass. And then the Bigfoot ruffled through the items, his focus intense, and his eyes widened as he grabbed the Hungarian pipe. And once again he roared so loudly that I could swear the ground beneath me vibrated indignantly, and my feet wobbled unsteadily. He studied the Hungarian pipe in his thick fingers, snarling in disgust, his nostrils flaring. I realized he found what he was looking for, and he found it to be very offensive. How could the Bigfoot have known the pipe was lying in this toolbox? Could he have picked up on the ungodly energy of the thing? I was mesmerized by what I was beholding, but what happened next sent the fear of God shooting into every single cell in my body, so that everything within me rattled with a foreboding sense of impending dread. So much so that I was physically incapable of reacting or putting up any defense, but that would have been useless, because the thing attacking me I could not physically see. I could feel the powerful fists from a violent heavy hand thrusting into my back so hard that inwardly I squirmed in pain. Then my ears began to tickle, as I felt heavy breathing on my neck and in my ears. I was faint with horror, my mouth opened and closed with the full intention of screaming, but my voice box was tongue-tied. No words came out. That was when I heard the disembodied, raspy voice in my ear, using even fouler words that I can care to mention, involving women's body parts in a derogatory manner. And then he screamed, "Stop him now, you bitch! Stop him now!" The fist jabbed into me again, and I almost jumped out of my skin as the voice growled into my ear threateningly. And when I turned around, I saw him, the most evil, despicable-looking man that I have ever beheld in my life, with eyes so black they were completely devoid of light. He was giving me murderous looks. His villainous face was almost disfigured by the hatred he unleashed towards me, so that he almost became like an ugly, grotesque-looking gargoyle. He screamed at me, "Stop him, you bitch! Stop him now!" He pushed me so hard that I fell flat on my face onto the ground, grazing my chin, and rubbing my nose so hard that it began to bleed. I raised myself to my feet, wiping my bloody nose with the back of my sleeve. I looked behind me, but the evil-looking entity had all but gone. But I could still feel him watching me, his eyes burning into me like red-hot coals, and I was so afraid. I could sense he was trying to physically push me to approach the Bigfoot and retrieve the pipe for him. Where was he? And more to the point, who was he? Why couldn't I see him any more? He was there only a moment ago. I turned around to watch the Bigfoot. He was roaring again. His anger seemed insatiable, like a hungry wildfire you couldn't easily put out. I watched in amazement as the Bigfoot threw the pipe onto the ground, and beneath his powerful, ponderous feet he began crushing it into a fine powder. I heard the voice screaming into my ear again, "Look what you've done, you bitch! Look what you've done! I'll get you for this!" And when I turned around, the human figure with the contorted face was there for a moment and then vaporized before my eyes like a ghost. But I have never beheld such evil as I did in that contorted, disfigured face, scrunched up by the expression of a vengeful hatred. But I knew he had been defeated by the Bigfoot. But he screamed in the quiet silence of the night. I could hear his voice. "I'll be back! I will be back! The devil rides with me!" I am certain I encountered the evil spirit of the serial killer, whose connection to this world was through his pipe. But now the Bigfoot had obliterated it, and his power had gone. The Bigfoot roared again, but this time the roar sounded contented and satisfied, rather like a lion who's eaten a hearty meal, and feels comfortably full and satisfied, and reasonably mellow as a result, almost as if his former anger had all but whittled away. He turned around and glided away, moving with such an incredible grace, as he swung his arms backwards and forwards through the grove of trees, until he was gone. And in that moment an incredible peace washed over me, as I knew I would never have to worry about that pipe again. Suffice to say, the first thing my husband said when he saw the state of the yard shed the following morning, the broken door, and the buckled-up toolbox lying across the grass, "What the hell happened here?" I looked at him and sighed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Let's just say some things are stranger than fiction. So there you are. That's my story."
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.